Putin's burgeoning Russian empire is collapsing from the inside. To the man who has seemingly made it his life's work to turn Russia into what it used to be, this is a horror story. For more than a decade, he's been trying to claim land for his beloved Russia. The 2008 invasion of Georgia set alarm bells ringing. He followed that up with the 2014 annexation of Crimea, and in February 2022, he launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine that continues to this day. He did it all, in part, to reclaim territory that he believes Russia should rightfully own. But all he's achieved is laying the foundation for the collapse of Russia as we know it, as he has left his country on the brink of civil war. Putin's citizens are turning against him. His position as the strongman of Russian politics is in serious jeopardy. And the worst thing about all of this for Putin, we've seen it all happen before. The collapse of an empire requires a catalyst. That catalyst came on August 6, 2024, when Ukraine did something nobody believed it would ever do: invade the Kursk Oblast. Interestingly, the first news about the Kursk invasion didn't come from Ukraine. It made no grand proclamations of its intention to take Russian territory. Rather, they came from Russia, with the country's defense ministry announcing that a group of 300 Ukrainian soldiers had crossed the border into Kursk at 8 a.m. on August 6th. Those soldiers apparently wore blue tape around their arms, making them distinguishable from their enemies, and were accompanied by a small number of tanks and armored vehicles. The initial attack focused on checkpoints across the border, where the few dozen Russian border guards, many of whom were young conscripts with little experience of actual war, were quick to surrender to the invading Ukrainians. At the time, Russia claimed to have repelled the attack. The truth would turn out to be the exact opposite. Within a day of the invasion starting, Ukrainian armored vehicles were seen racing toward the town of Sudza, which is just 6 miles behind the front lines. By the third day, Ukraine's soldiers had reached Korovino, a small village 13 miles inside the border. More gains followed. Ukraine kept advancing, taking villages along the way. 10 days into the invasion, Ukraine had taken Sudza, establishing it as a command center from which to coordinate future attacks. This prompted Putin to promise that he would deliver a worthy response to the invasion. That response is yet to come. Instead, this initial week and a half of the Kursk invasion saw Russia being forced to evacuate around 200,000 civilians from the region, while Putin was left scrambling to pull some of the 500,000 troops he had stationed in Ukraine to mount a proper defense against them. Fast forward to the end of August, the time of writing the script for this video, and Ukraine now claims to control almost 500 square miles of Russian territory within the Kursk region. That's according to its main military commander, General Alexander Syrsky, who also adds that Ukraine has captured 594 Russian prisoners so far as part of the operation. For context, the amount of seized territory is roughly the same size as Los Angeles, according to the LA Times. Further reports, this time from the BBC, claim that Ukraine now controls about 100 Russian settlements within those 500 square miles, each of which can now be fortified against the likely Russian counterattack. The entire invasion has been an enormous humiliation for Putin. For the entire war, he set himself up as the strongman of Russia, a role that many a Russian leader before him has attempted to play: authoritative, decisive, strong enough to do what needs to be done. This was the image Putin hoped to cultivate, and a large part of his success in creating that image lay in his ability to portray Russia as impenetrable. The average Russian citizen wouldn't have to worry about the Ukraine war, he could argue. The entire conflict would take place in Ukraine. At no point would war come to Russia's collective doorstep. The Kursk invasion proved that to be false. And that leads us to a question: why did Ukraine invade Kursk in the first place? It certainly doesn't intend to annex the region and claim it as part of Ukraine, as Putin did with Crimea back in 2014. Though Ukraine is pouring more and more troops into the region, with Forbes saying it has plans to send 15,000 soldiers along with a pair of air assault brigades, those soldiers aren't tasked with turning Kursk over to Ukrainian hands. The taking of territory in Kursk does not signify the start of a larger invasion that will see Putin's empire crumble as a result of him losing country to invading Ukrainians. Zelensky's intentions are a little more complex than that. One interpretation is that the Kursk invasion is supposed to act as a diversionary tactic. Ukraine hopes that forcing Russia to divert troops to Kursk will relieve pressure on the beleaguered Donbas region in Ukraine, where Putin has focused most of his attacks in 2024 and where Russia is slowly gaining territory. In particular, Zelensky may have hoped to draw Russian soldiers away from Pokrovsk, which Forbes claims is one of Putin's main objectives in his eastern offensive in Ukraine. If that was the intention, the invasion may have failed in its diversionary goal. On August 28, Forbes reported that Russia had taken the Ukrainian village of Novorodivka, which lies just 5 miles outside of Pokrovsk. Putin is likely setting up for a renewed offensive, and Ukraine's commitment of troops to Kursk could mean that it's less able to mount a sturdy defense in response. Other motives put forward by Harvard University Ukrainian Research Institution fellow Paul Danieri seem to make more sense. Speaking to the University of California, Riverside, he points out that it's not clear exactly how the Kursk invasion will affect the key battles being fought in the Ukraine war. However, it serves other purposes. The invasion's initial success, he says, is clearly a big morale booster for Ukrainians and a political problem for Putin and his military leaders. The latter issue is extremely important in terms of why Kursk could prove to be the catalyst for the collapse of modern Russia. As Danieri points out, Putin took the rare step of appearing on Russian television to dress down his military leaders in front of the entire nation. His intention was clear: continue to project the strongman image that served him so well as Russian leader. The problem lies in what the Kursk invasion has managed to achieve: the shattering of Russia's aura of invincibility. Putin's dressing down of his military leaders took place while Ukraine was taking more territory and thousands of Russians were being evacuated. Putin could no longer hold himself up as the man to protect Russia. Dressing down his military leaders in public may also prove to be a mistake. After all, it raises questions as to why those leaders were appointed in the first place, if they were incompetent enough to allow a Ukrainian invasion. The Russian people may not be able to question Putin publicly, but privately, many are likely starting to doubt the decision-making capabilities of their leader. Therein we find what may be the true motive for the Kursk invasion. Zelensky likely knows that Ukraine can't hold Kursk forever. Russia will launch a counter-offensive at some point. Deputy CIA Director David Cohen says this is practically an inevitability, saying on August 28th, "We can be certain that Putin will mount a counter-offensive to try to reclaim that territory." He notes that it will be a difficult fight for Russia, especially as Putin's slow response has afforded Ukraine time to build defensive lines, but the counterattack is coming. Unfortunately for Putin, the response may be too little too late. Ukraine has already achieved one of its primary goals of rattling Russia's faith in its militaristic leader. The strongman image is shattered, not only for the Russian military as a whole, but also for the man who leads it. And if everything goes according to plan for Ukraine, the Kursk invasion will serve as both the turning point for the Ukraine war and the beginning of the end for Putin. Of course, that brings us to an obvious question: how? How could the Kursk invasion trigger a civil war in Russia, or at the very least, lead to the burgeoning empire Putin is trying to build collapsing? The answer starts with something to which we've already alluded. The Kursk invasion showcases Putin's military miscalculations. This starts with his failure to reinforce Russia's northern borders with Ukraine, as Putin has poured all of his efforts into the eastern offensive during 2024. That led to the situation we saw on August 6th, when Ukraine's forces were able to easily overcome Russia's border checkpoints. Putin has assigned recent Russian conscript to those checkpoints, none of whom had the experience or ability to fight back against the incoming Ukrainian forces. Worse yet, as retired Russian General Andrei Gurylev, who is a member of the lower house of Russia's parliament, points out, those border soldiers had no intelligence. Regrettably, the group of forces protecting the border didn't have its own intelligence assets, he claimed on the Telegram messaging app. No one likes to see the truth in reports. Everybody just wants to hear that all is good. The truth in reports. Those 4 words are a reflection of the fact that many in Russia, including some in its own political circles, recognize that the information they get from state-owned media outlets is tailored to keep Putin in power. Russia's leader isn't telling his people the truth about what's happening in Kursk, but his attempts to pull the wool over their eyes are failing. After all, they can see the evidence with their own eyes. Russia has lost territory, and the people of Kursk are being evacuated. All of this can be traced back to Putin's military mistakes, both in terms of failing to secure the Kursk border and not providing his troops with the intelligence they needed. Putin made another mistake. He underestimated General Alexander Syrsky. Now Ukraine's top military officer, Syrsky commanded Ukraine's forces in Kharkiv in 2022, leading the country to a victory over the invading Russian forces that played a key role in Russia's failure to secure Kyiv in the early weeks of the war. Syrsky is a man who had the call sign Snow Leopard, and he's also the man who took over from General Valery Zaluzhny after Zelensky ousted his former military leader in early 2024. Putin's mistake lay in assuming that Syrsky would take the same approach as his predecessor when it comes to launching attacks against Russian forces. In 2023, Zaluzhny was the man responsible for organizing a Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russia. That counteroffensive failed, not least because it was so highly publicized that Russia had plenty of time to set up defenses that enabled them to hold the territory Ukraine hoped to retake. Putin got to look like a military genius in front of his people, the man who organized Russia's military to hold off the biggest offensive Ukraine was capable of mustering. But the reality was that Putin's success only came because of Zaluzhny's failings, with Syrsky being a far different beast. Ukraine's new military leader is described as an obsessive planner with iron discipline by Sky News, with Al Jazeera noting that some in Ukraine call him the Butcher. He also favors quiet and precise strikes against his enemies over full-blown and well-publicized offensives. We saw this in his approach to taking on a Putin-backed insurgency in eastern Ukraine back in 2014, during which the Russian security official Dmitry Medvedev described him using tactics that were similar to how this cat hunts, in reference to his snow leopard call sign. So the warning signs were there. Any attack arranged by Syrskyi would be extremely well organized and would not involve an all-out offensive at which body after body is thrown. The strikes would be small, precise, scattered. In other words, exactly what we've seen in Kursk, as Ukraine's forces conduct tactical strikes against their Russian opposition by using smaller groups. Putin should have known all of this about Syrskyi. He'd seen plenty of Syrskyi's approach on the battlefield, yet he underestimated the Ukrainian military leader and, by extension, underestimated Ukraine's ability to take Russian territory. Here we start to see some parallels between Putin and his Soviet-era predecessors. After all, Russia has a history of underestimating its opponents. In the 1980s, Russia entered Afghanistan, believing that it would be able to quickly destroy the rebels in that country and subjugate it under Soviet rule. The Soviet Union failed. It wound up stuck in a quagmire of a war that lasted for almost a decade and led to the deaths of 15,000 Soviet soldiers. Russia was forced to withdraw. Bruce Riedel, who worked on the CIA's plan to aid the Afghan rebels at the time, points out that Putin seems to have underestimated the Ukrainians today, in the same way that the Soviet Union underestimated Afghanistan. Milton Bearden, another CIA operative during the Afghanistan war, puts it more pointedly. In setting out to reverse history, Putin may instead be repeating it. Patterns are starting to repeat. The Ukraine war, which was meant to be over in a matter of weeks, has descended into a quagmire similar to that seen in Afghanistan in the 80s. Only this time it's a quagmire that's costing far more Russian lives, 612,390, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance and various other outlets. The Washington Post says that Russia's war in Afghanistan led to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Putin's underestimation of his Ukrainian enemy may be taking him and today's Russia down the very same path. Underestimating his enemy isn't the only way that Putin has undermined his own position. The Kursk invasion is just one of several examples during his reign in which he's failed to protect the Russian people. The Conversation published a piece covering this toward the end of August 2024, noting that Kursk is just the latest puncture hole in Putin's image of protector in a long line. It points out that the Ukraine war has seen multiple Russian towns and cities, including Moscow, be subjected to drone attacks by Ukraine. It also draws parallels between the Kursk invasion and another famous Kursk incident, the sinking of the nuclear submarine that bore the oblast's name. On August 12, 2000, around 3 months after Putin first became Russia's president, the Kursk submarine experienced an explosion in one of its torpedo hatches. Most of the submarine's 118-member crew died, though 23 survivors managed to barricade themselves in a compartment of the submarine where they awaited rescue. Here was an opportunity for Putin to solidify his reputation as a protector of the Russian people. Instead, he delayed. Putin refused foreign help for fear that doing so would make him look weak. When Norwegian divers were eventually allowed down into the submarine on August 21st, the 23 survivors of the blast were dead. Putin refused to talk about the incident, going so far as to not even cancel a vacation he was taking in Sochi when the crisis occurred. A pattern of behavior had been set. On September 1, 2004, a group of 30 armed militants stormed a school in the Russian city of Beslan, taking 1,000 hostages that included children, family members, and teachers. Putin acted a little quicker this time. He ordered special forces to enter the building on September 3rd. A bloodbath ensued. The chaotic battle led to hundreds of the hostages being killed, including 186 children. Both survivors and relatives of those killed sued the Russian government via the European Court of Human Rights, alleging that Putin had mishandled the entire situation. They won. The court ruled that Russia's government had failed to protect the hostages. What does all of this mean? More patterns are emerging. Not only does Putin regularly underestimate the situations he faces, but he often makes the wrong decisions. These decisions have an impact on the Russian people, whether those be the 23 who die in the submarine because he delays, or hundreds dying in a school because he bungles. His mismanagement of the Kursk invasion is yet another example of Putin's failure to protect his people, and it may be the final straw. Again, we see parallels with the Soviet Union, in the sense that as powerful as a leader may be, it's the people who ultimately control the fate of their countries. The fall of the Soviet Union was precipitated by mass protests, such as the April 1991 protest in Minsk's Lenin Square and the August 1989 protest featuring 2 million people in the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The people were making their unhappiness with the current regime known. Putin's failure to protect his people, a pattern that he has displayed throughout his leadership, could lead to similar situations in today's Russia. After all, he's already having to deal with fury amongst those people. On August 17, 2024, The Guardian published a piece in which it spoke to a Russian woman named Lyubov Antipova. The daughter of elderly parents who lived in Zalshenka, a village in the Kursk region. She claims that she implored her parents to leave their village when she first started hearing rumors about an invasion. Antipova's parents didn't listen. Why would they? Putin was in charge and they hadn't seen any sort of invasion since World War II. Then the photographs started filtering through. One showed Ukrainian troops standing outside a supermarket near the office of a gas company. Antipova knew the location well. It was only around 150 feet from her parents' home. "We were sure the Russian army would protect us," Antipova says. "I'm amazed how quickly the Ukrainian forces advanced." Others in Kursk were similarly caught off guard by the invasion. Alexander Zorin, who is the curator of the city's archaeology museum, says that the reports being given to him were inaccurate. Officials' reports were not scary at all. 100 saboteurs went in, he says. But then it went up to 300, 800. It was impossible to get a clear picture. Zorin would wind up being one of the 200,000 people who have since been evacuated from Kursk. Other Russian citizens have expressed anger about Putin's response to the Kursk invasion. Speaking to CBC, a Ukrainian soldier who wishes to be identified by the tagline "Wolverine" said that many of the citizens he encountered have expressed anger at the authorities. They speak about betrayal from the Russian government. They did not declare evacuation and immediately turned off water and light, so they created unbearable living conditions, he claimed. He also provided CBC with a short, albeit edited video that showed a Russian man complaining about feeling abandoned by Russian authorities. Of course, none of these people mentioned Putin by name. To do so would be to invite repercussions, but the message is clear. Putin is the head of Russia and the man who put these authorities in place. Once again, he had failed to protect his people. What's more, that lack of protection was accompanied by a constant campaign of disinformation. Again, much as was seen throughout the entirety of the Soviet Union's existence, that led many in Kursk to fail to protect themselves because they didn't understand the sheer scale of what was coming. Putin is on the verge of losing the support of his people. And that's not his only problem when it comes to his own people. A strongman politician like Putin relies on support from his country's elite. It's a you scratch our back and we'll scratch yours situation, in which the elite use their influence to prop up the leader as long as they feel they're getting something in return. Those elites may also be starting to turn against Putin. After all, many have been affected by the Western sanctions that have been put in place since the beginning of the war. Oligarchs and officials close to Putin have also felt the sting of the West freezing their assets. In addition to the $300 billion in Russian central bank assets that the West has frozen and are now being used to fund Ukraine, another $30 billion in assets owned by officials and oligarchs are also immobilized. Russia's elites, though they'll never see the war up close, are feeling its pinch in their pockets. Many have been oddly silent about the war, with few coming out to express full support for Putin. A handful even believe that Russia could lose. In June 2023, Pravda published a report citing a Bloomberg article from the same month, stating that some of Russia's elite are experiencing a deepening gloom. Even the most optimistic among them believe that the best outcome possible now is a frozen conflict in which both countries declare ceasefires without actively ending the war. The piece also quotes Kirill Rogov, a former advisor to Putin who left Russia after the invasion began. They're afraid to become scapegoats for a meaningless war, he says. It's really surprising how widespread among the Russian elite became the idea of a chance Putin won't win this war. Bear in mind these comments came in June 2023, over a year later, and those elites are watching as Putin has failed to repel an invasion into Russian territory. Where does all of this leave Putin when it comes to his people? It would be inaccurate to claim that the general citizens are calling for the Russian leader's head. They aren't, and any who would like to would be restricted from doing so by Putin's policies anyway. But there's a clear feeling of discontent. The people of Kursk are angry, and not only with the misinformation Putin has spread, but his lack of proper response to the invasion that once again showcases his pattern of failing to take decisive action in service of his people. Putin also appears to be losing the support of some of Russia's elite, with discontent growing and an ever-increasing feeling that Russia isn't going to win the Ukraine war looming over that segment of the population. In short, Putin is losing the support of his people. And as Russia's own history has shown time and again, even an authoritarian strongman leader is at risk of seeing their empire crumble once the people turn against them. The Kursk invasion may prove to be the catalyst for rebellion against Putin, but could such a rebellion lead to civil war? While that may seem like an impossibility on the surface, it's worth remembering that Russia came very close to experiencing a civil war in June 2023. That's when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former leader of the Wagner private military group, essentially declared an insurrection against Putin and Russia's military leaders. Wagner had already played a key role in the Ukraine war, with the brutal group having been involved almost from the beginning. German intelligence claims that Wagner soldiers were involved in the massacre of Ukrainian civilians in the Ukrainian town of Bucha in March 2022, with Ukraine also claiming that a trio of Wagner mercenaries were responsible for capturing, torturing, and killing Ukrainian civilians near Kyiv a month later. By June 2023, Wagner had grown dissatisfied with how Putin was leading the war, resulting in the force, under Prigozhin's leadership, advancing through the city of Rostov-on-Don to surround Russia's southern military headquarters. The coup ended quickly, with Prigozhin reversing his decision very soon after. Still, it showcases just how tenuous Putin's hold on power may be. If a group like Wagner is able to gain support from Russia's rank-and-file military, according to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, such insurrections would grow larger and far more significant. If those rebels gain the support of the Russian people, whose collective confidence in Putin as a protector and strongman has already been shaken, the potential for a civil war that leads to Putin being ousted will only grow. Add to all of this that Putin is making many of the same mistakes made by the Soviet leaders who came before him. We see this in the repeated nuclear threats toward both Ukraine and nations that have supported it during the war. Such threats of nuclear war were constant during the Cold War, though no Soviet leader ever followed up on them. Putin is doing the same thing, threatening nukes without deploying them. Not only do these empty threats reinforce Ukraine's confidence when crossing red lines in the war, but they once again showcase Putin as a man who doesn't back up his words to the Russian people. But perhaps most damaging to Putin is the potential for his people to start seeing him as a mirror image of Joseph Stalin. According to the Hoover Institute, Putin mirrors Stalin in many ways. While he may not have swept up millions in purges, Putin has never shied away from getting rid of his enemies. We need only look at Yevgeny Prigozhin for evidence of that. The former Wagner leader died in August 2023 when his business jet crashed over the Tver Oblast. The likely cause of that explosion was a bomb placed on the plane by a Putin-aligned saboteur. Putin also mirrors Stalin in other ways. Both are militaristic leaders, even if Putin doesn't wear his uniform as Stalin did, and both relied on projecting powerful images to remain in control. Both also routinely replace the people around them, with a specific focus on military generals who failed to achieve the outcomes they'd hoped to. Hoover also points out that the two share motifs in their propaganda, with each calling for sacrifices in service of the motherland, with those sacrifices coming in the form of the blood of their people. You could even argue that Putin displays a callous disregard for the Russian people, as seen in the Kursk submarine incident and the bungled approach to the Beslan hostage crisis. Each are echoes of Stalin's willingness to kill his own to maintain his power base. Parallels among parallels, not just in personality but in approach. Ultimately, it's those parallels that may spell the end for Putin and cause his Russian empire to crumble. He's failed to learn from the mistakes of his country's past. It's Putin's underestimation of his enemies and overestimation of himself that allowed the Kursk invasion to happen. As a result of that invasion, discontent is growing among his people, with that discontent only adding to that felt by many of the Russian elite. Putin has already had to fight off one insurrection during the war, and there's a good chance more will come as his people grow increasingly disaffected. Vladimir Putin is on shaky ground. Ground that's so shaky that it may be his own people who defeat him before Ukraine does, which might come as early as 2025 if some strategists are correct, but more on that in some of our other videos. But what do you think? Does Putin stand on the precipice of losing his power, or will he find some way to recover his strongman image? 2.5 years into one of the deadliest conflicts of the 21st century, Russia teeters on the brink of an economic abyss. The cause? A silent, insidious disease, one that could cripple the nation's future. Not COVID-19, though that too has taken its toll. This is a different kind of disease, one that thrives not in the body, but in the very fabric of Russia's society and economy. It's a disease that's brought down empires before, and now it's festering within Russia's energy-rich veins. This isn't a virus, but its effects are no less devastating. This is the Dutch disease, an economic curse that's resurfaced time and again, pulling nations from power to peril. Russia, it seems, has caught this disease through its vast energy reserves. But how deep does the infection run? How rapidly is it spreading? And could it spell the end for Putin's reign? Let's unravel the mystery. Russia is one of the world's largest suppliers of natural gas and crude oil. However, the country has almost completely realigned its main economic sectors, energy manufacturing and service, towards catering for the needs of extracting and exporting non-renewable energy resources. Sure, this has allowed Russia to start the war relatively unimpeded, allowing it to fuel its war machine with billions of dollars of investments that were diverted from energy exports. However, this reliance on the energy sector as a whole can have widespread consequences that stack one upon another until they bring the country to the brink of collapse. This might finally be enough to remove the ruling class from the head of state and create a revolution in Russia. Let's start with some numbers. Russia has arguably been one of the countries that's bounced back from the effects of COVID-19 fastest, managing to grow its economy while the West stagnated. Even now, in 2024, the Russian economy is growing at a pace of 2.6%, which is more than a full percentage point than the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, predicted at the end of October 2023. Compare this to the economic growth of the EU, Russia's closest ideological and military opponent, which is slated to be only 1%. The figures are starting to paint a slightly dim picture of how the West is doing compared to what is effectively a war economy. But that's not exactly the full story. While the Russian budget is indeed increasing year after year, nearly 40% of the 2024 budget is expected to be spent on military and national defense. This translates to roughly 6% of the country's GDP, a figure unheard of in Western countries. For comparison, the US is projecting that its national defense budget is only 3% of its GDP, while most of Europe is peddling figures around 2.1%. Of course, it pays to take into account that the US total GDP is still magnitudes larger than that of Russia, but the precedent is undeniable. Russia's economy is growing on paper, but the country is wrapping up that growth into its war machine instead of sectors that are more important in the long term: manufacturing, service, and infrastructure. Additionally, the country is pretty much all in on its reliance on trade. Roughly 30% of the country's GDP comes from exports, compared to only 12.5% for the US. As a result, Russia has become increasingly dependent on trade, but those trading partners might not remain partners for long. This falls back to the aforementioned reliance on energy export. Between 2022 and 2024, Russian revenue from fuel exports dropped from around 1.360 million in US dollars to 820 million per day, a nearly 40% decrease. This includes the fact that the country is currently on a slight upswing due to increased exports to India and China, arguably two of the largest resource trading partners. The lowest point in the fuel revenue in recent years was in July 2023 at around $680 million per day, roughly half of the revenue at the start of the invasion. This means that the Russian economy, which is already extremely dependent on exporting stuff out of the country, has been exporting fewer energy products for the past few years. Which brings us back to the crux of the issue and the main forecast behind the country's potential collapse: the Dutch disease. Coined in 1977, the Dutch disease is a years-long process where the country's economy suffers due to an unexpected windfall in a specific sector, primarily in natural resources. The disease was named after the Dutch discovered the Groningen natural gas field in 1959. This led to the country's energy sector booming, seemingly with no downsides at first, and the economy received a solid boon over the next few years. This sounds great for the Dutch, right? Wrong. As the energy sector grew, the manpower required to sustain it didn't. The growing demand for workers shifted the availability of manpower from other fields, particularly industry and manufacturing, to employ more people in the energy sector. Economists observed that the manufacturing sector fell rapidly, which caused rapid political discontent in its wake. In general, however, the symptoms of the Dutch disease can vary between one country or economy and the next. The main principles are that a country has at least 3 overlapping sectors, one of which is non-tradable, typically the service sector which supports the internal population, while the others are such as manufacturing, energy, or agriculture. The first symptom of the disease is that one of the tradable sectors experiences a sudden boom. In the case of the Netherlands and Russia, this is the energy sector and is referred to as the resource movement effect. Much like the Dutch discovered a significant deposit of natural resources, Russia has already been working on expanding its energy exports for decades. This has only been exacerbated as Russia has been on the receiving end of more and more embargoes from Western countries. However, the other tradable sectors typically can't compete with this growth. As the booming sector starts requiring more people and investments to maintain this growth, it begins eating away at others, with people transferring sectors for better salaries and more lucrative returns. Effectively, this leads to reducing the level of industrialization, agricultural self-sufficiency, or internal manufacturing. Of course, the energy sector has comparatively few manpower demands compared to manufacturing. The actual or direct deindustrialization can be negligible for most countries affected by the disease, including the Netherlands in the 60s and Russia today. What follows, however, is that the people who were already employed in the energy sector and the few converts from the industry field suddenly have a lot more capital at their disposal. Apart from binding this in investments, the improved spending capability encourages growth in the non-tradable sectors, as the economic processes encourage the newly gained money to be circulated through the population. This leads to increased demands and earnings in the service sectors. Now, this can have a much more significant effect on the manpower availability between the various sectors. Since people generally won't be leaving the booming sector, the growth of the service sector puts even more strain on manufacturing or agriculture as the population shifts from producing products to offering services. This spending effect creates indirect deindustrialization. The same process is currently being applied to Russia, but is exacerbated by the country's ongoing conflict and investment in national defense. Furthermore, as the country's population turns more towards a single tradable sector and a non-tradable one, the country's currency exchange rate might fluctuate. In Russia's case, for example, foreign energy buyers need to transact in rubles and the services are typically paid for in rubles, requiring foreign investors to exchange their currency for rubles. However, this fluctuation in exchange rates can make it more worthwhile for end users to purchase manufactured products from abroad. This creates even more pressure on the non-booming sectors, plunging the country further into reliance on the single booming sector and services to keep the budget afloat. This can be summarized by the volatile ruble exchange rate over the past few years. If we take a look at the 5-year US dollar to ruble exchange rate, the month after the invasion saw the rate skyrocket by nearly 70% to over 120%. A few months later, in March 2022, the rate plunged into a 9-year low, $1 equaling 50 rubles. Based on previous trends, the ruble exchange rate has a bit of a correlation to the price of crude oil and gas. To Russia's credit, the country's government has taken significant steps to reduce the connection between the ruble and fuel prices, with several policies to reduce foreign spending and tie the price of the ruble to the country's gold reserves. But how exactly can a country die from the Dutch disease? Well, while Russia has done as much as possible to disentangle the price of the ruble from the price of natural gas and crude oil, it's still highly dependent on exporting those resources to other countries. As such, the booming energy sector is highly volatile to external changes in the global market. For the simplest example, other oil and gas producing countries such as Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the US or Canada also have significant oil and gas reserves and comparable abilities to export these resources across the world. While Russia arguably has the biggest oil export surplus, the difference between exports and imports, this position can easily be overturned by Saudi Arabia or even the US due to the increasing industrialization and utilization of oil fields in Texas. In a hypothetical situation, Saudi Arabia or the US could start pumping out more oil and gas from their fields and exporting them to countries that Russia traditionally trades with. This could lead to a drop in fossil fuel prices, which could cause Russia's energy sector to lower its investment interests and cease being the booming sector. If that happens and the oil and gas magnates can no longer prop up the sector with their wealth, this deficit will trickle down to the service sector. Without the funding provided by the booming sector, the service sector would become another strain on the country's economy. This will be made worse by the fact that the country has been deindustrialized, with a lack of domestic agriculture and manufacturing capability. For a country with the Dutch disease, the booming sector effectively becomes the lifeline that's keeping the economy afloat. If the sector stops generating revenue, the other sectors will fall around it like a house of cards. This brings about the polarity between Russia's natural resources and its ability to utilize them as a driver behind the country's economy. As mentioned, the country is significantly more dependent on oil and gas exports to power its budget compared to other world economies such as the US, EU, and China. On the other hand, the country's hostile takeovers of various former Soviet territories in the previous decades have severely deteriorated foreign relations with most of the Western world. This has led to a slew of economic sanctions, starting with the 2014 annexation of Crimea and peaking with the full-blown invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Right now, the country is practically barred from trading in US dollars, relying on ruble and yuan trading for the bulk of its import and export needs. Additionally, the sanctions have also led to a centralization of the country's export efforts. This is perhaps most notable in the energy sector. While Russia's oil exports haven't declined noticeably since the start of the 2022 invasion, the range of countries to which Russia exports has been reduced significantly. For example, while the EU was one of the biggest importers of Russian oil and gas, the current trade is less than 20% of pre-invasion numbers. Additionally, Russian exports to the UK and the US, while not particularly significant compared to the bulk of others, have stopped completely. Conversely, China, India, and to a lesser extent Turkey currently account for more than 65% of Russia's oil exports. This puts Russia in somewhat of a bind, as the countries have the ability to negotiate the prices of Russian resources, allowing them to get lower prices than anywhere else in the world. As an example, the 2023 deal between China and Russia allowed China to get Russian natural gas at nearly half the price than usual. This cements the stranglehold that the global economy is slowly putting on Russia, worsening the potential debilitating consequences of the Dutch disease. Of course, the second symptom of Russia's Dutch disease has been starting to show, particularly in regard to the near monopolization of imported manufactured products. The current trade between China and Russia is yet another such example. China currently accounts for roughly 30% of Russian imports and 38% of exports. In particular, the car market in Russia is represented by around 60% of Chinese vehicles, compared to the measly 9% in February 2022, just before the invasion. A similar concept applies to tractor imports, which are vital for the country's agriculture. As another non-booming sector, Russia's agriculture could take a significant hit if the manufactured products required to keep the industry running are imported from abroad. This ties into the indirect deindustrialization mentioned as one of the symptoms of the disease. But how susceptible is the country to the Dutch disease? As mentioned, the country's GDP growth has arguably stabilized and even exceeded the IMF's expectations. While the country's manufacturing sector has arguably taken a hit, per the Dutch disease hypothesis, the country's weapons and munitions manufacturing increased significantly. For example, Russia has produced more than 67% more ships and aircraft and 46% more non-car motor vehicles throughout 2023 than in the previous year. However, it's not certain whether Russia can actually sustain these efforts for long, as the Western sanctions have also prevented Russia from accessing the newest technologies in the sectors. As a result, Russia can only eventually produce quantity rather than quality, which might not directly correlate to long-term economic growth and prosperity. Sure, China's industrialization in the 20th century led to it becoming one of the biggest economies in the world, but this upheaval is highly unlikely for a country that is already relatively industrialized and disconnected from the Western world. One of the biggest long-term problems that Russia faces in the coming years is its short-term infusion towards military and national defense spending. We already mentioned that roughly 30 to 40% of the government's 2024 budget was allocated to these sectors. This comes at the expense of all others. While the energy sector is relatively safe from downturns due to the sheer availability of resources and interdependence with the Russian economies, others are not likely to fare as well. For example, over 100,000 of the country's IT specialists have emigrated in 2022 alone, and seemingly might not have any plans to return. The total number of emigrants is estimated to be over 800,000, which is also likely to put even more strain on the country's economy in both the short and long term. Not only is this a blow to the country's service sector, but it also reduces the potential manpower Russia can enlist in its war effort against Ukraine. The construction of the national budget on non-military sectors, as well as the country's declining educated population, will likely correlate with a lowered quality of life throughout Russia in the coming years. While it's possible that Russia can reverse course on some of the policies that try to spark a bit of life in the industrial sector, its current focus on powering the war machine and supporting the energy industry makes this prospect unlikely. As a result, Russia is slowly choked by its over-reliance on war and energy exports to support its government and economy. We have to remember that Russia is currently heavily dependent on China for imports and exports. Additionally, the countries have seemingly aligned foreign policies. While this would mean that ideally, Russia could prosper from being under China's wing, this might not be entirely true. You see, China might not be all in on supporting Russia's efforts and bolstering its economy. While the two countries are allies on paper, there's still a bit of bad blood between them in historical context. This is particularly important in the bordering region of Outer Manchuria, which China was forced to cede to Russia after the Opium Wars in the 19th century. The region is extremely far away from the centralized Russian government in the Kremlin. Its population is also roughly 1/20th of the Chinese population in the regions across its border. In recent months, China has started pushing to resolve the issue of Outer Manchuria, at least for the issues it perceived. For example, recent Chinese maps have relabeled Russian cities in the region with their Chinese counterparts or historical names prior to the Russian annexation. The border between Outer Manchuria and China is also composed of two vital rivers, Amur and Ussuri, which can be a significant boon to China's meager water resources. Also, the rivers allow easy access to the Sea of Japan. This would be a vital diversification in China's ability to send maritime trading routes, bypassing the contested South China Sea, which has a bottleneck in the Strait of Malacca. Furthermore, Outer Manchuria could be a staging ground for a more widespread Chinese invasion of Russia to secure better access to Siberian resources. Siberia is particularly important to China due to its abundance of natural resources including drinking water, timber and minerals. All of these are something that China sorely lacks, especially in the northern population centers, which severely lack drinking water, and the booming Chinese manufacturing industries that rely on timber and iron. Siberia's relative remoteness from the Kremlin and the Russo-Ukrainian front means that Russia doesn't exert nearly as much control over the area, leaving it potentially open to Chinese influence. An attempt to seize the reins over the Siberian drinking water supply has been made in the 2010s, with many Chinese companies buying Russian land and attempting to create pipelines from Lake Baikal to the Chinese mainland. The lake is the largest reservoir of freshwater in the world, and the Chinese population could be supplied from it for decades. However, the local Russian government has managed to put a stop to those attempts, removing the Chinese influence in the area, at least for now. With Russia currently experiencing potential economic upheaval and focusing on war attempts in the West, the Siberian regions could be ripe for Chinese picking. Of course, China is currently being held up by the US influence, especially due to the Singaporean stranglehold of the Strait of Malacca, which is used by China's most important maritime trade routes. This puts China in a difficult position where it can't make offensive moves against Russia without the US disrupting its economy by blockading maritime trade. However, China's Belt and Road Initiative aims to reduce its dependence on maritime trade routes and connect it to countries across Asia. If China manages to relieve the pressure from the US, it could feasibly invade Russia to take its natural resources. Apart from removing a large chunk of Russian territory, it would remove the bulk of the Russian trade-based economy, quickening its collapse. But it's not only China that poses a threat to Russia's economy. India is also a significant contender, albeit more indirectly. While China is one of the US's biggest economic and ideological enemies, India has taken a different course in its foreign relations. As part of the quadrilateral security dialogue with the US, Australia, and Japan, India aims to reduce China's economic pressure in the region. As a result, India has been separating itself from China's economy and increasing its presence in the Indian Ocean, which allows it to control the Strait of Malacca indirectly. India has also started to cut itself off from the neighboring countries, which are heavily supported by China. Coupled with the support from the US, India is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the Europe-India corridor. The corridor is a sequence of trading routes that go from Europe across the Mediterranean to the Middle East via rail and maritime routes across the Indian Ocean. If implemented, it would more efficiently connect the US with India. It would also allow India to reduce its resource imports from Russia. India's reluctance to work with Chinese interests means it's likely to also work against Russian interests in the long term. If Russian exports to India slow down or stop, it would mean a significant blow to the Russian economy, effectively jump-starting the collapse heralded by the Dutch disease. With all that said, is there a timeline for how long it takes for the Dutch disease to run its course and cause significant economic upheaval? Unfortunately, the answer is all but simple. The IMF has identified that Russia either caught the Dutch disease all the way back in 2007 or at least had the potential to do so. This would mean that Russia has managed to stave off the negative effects of the process for at least 15 years. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 didn't seem to yield significant adverse reactions to the Russian economy. Due to the EU's dependence on Russian oil and gas at the time, the country was relatively unaffected by major symptoms of the disease. This was thanks to the booming energy sector being allowed to continue to grow and the negative deindustrialization cancelled out by sheer economic growth and incentives. Considering the timeline between the 2007 report, it's possible that the recent years have rapidly accelerated the progress of the disease and sped up the potential for Russian economic decline. If so, there's still some uncertainty as to how much Russia's economy can withstand foreign influence from both the West and its main trading partners, China and India. With Russia getting increasingly cut off from the Western world and the hostilities between NATO and Russia increasing, it's highly likely that China will become the decisive factor. Russia's economy can collapse if China cuts off the vital trade income and/or by outright hostile action. On the other hand, China might actively prop the country's economy to the point of complete dependence, making Russia all but a puppet for the Chinese interests in Eastern Europe. The progressing symptoms of the Dutch disease might prompt China into action, and the results could be devastating. But what do you think about the effect of the Dutch disease in Russia? Is the country's economy on the brink of collapse, and will China and the US capitalize on it? After embarrassing itself on the Ukrainian battlefield for most of 2022 and 2023, Russia seemed to turn things around in the first few months of 2024. Taking advantage of the fact that the $61 billion Ukrainian military aid package from the US was stalled in Congress, the country finally managed to regain battlefield initiative and capture some key territories. The Ukrainian stronghold of Avdiivka fell under Russian control. The villages of Semenivka, Pervomaiska, and Novobakhmutivka followed suit. After fierce battles raging around Chasiv Yar, a city pivotal for Russian advances in the Donetsk Oblast, Russia managed to capture parts of it. The Ukrainian forces started retreating from several areas of the Donbass after being badly outgunned and outmanned by their Russian foes. In other words, everything was falling into place for Russia. So you'd think that Russian President Vladimir Putin would be pretty confident and secure in his position, right? Wrong. It's quite the opposite, really. As July was nearing its end, Putin was in full panic mode. For the first time since the invasion of Ukraine started on February 24, 2022, one realization seems to have started settling in. Russia may have lost the war in Ukraine. But how did we get here? What caused Putin, a man known for his ruthless calculation and steely resolve, to face such crushing dread? And how did Russia go from seeming triumph to the precipice of defeat? We've got all the answers for you in this video. After hearing that Putin is in full panic mode, you might understandably ask a single question. How do you know that? After all, it's not like Putin is likely to broadcast his fears for the world to see. Well, the truth is that actions often speak louder than words, and even the words used often reek of desperation and fear, even though they're meant to project power. As hard as Russia is trying to keep this facade of strength, the cracks are beginning to show. So before examining what made Putin go into full panic mode, let's take a closer look at the key signs of his crumbling confidence. Putin's shocking cabinet reshuffle in May of 2024 was the first major sign that he felt his grip on power weakening. In a move that sent shockwaves around the globe, Putin replaced his long-standing Minister of Defense and longtime friend and close ally Sergei Shoigu with an economist with no military experience, Andrei Belyusov. Now, for the most part, this move was seen as the most obvious sign that Russia was placing its economy on a war footing, preparing for a long war in Ukraine and beyond. But beneath the surface, this reshuffle signaled more than just an economic pivot. It signaled that Putin's worst fear, the rise of his Kremlin rivals, was potentially becoming a reality once again. And after the disastrous impact of Yevgeny Prigozhin's June 2023 rebellion, Putin couldn't take any chances. By removing Shoigu from his post, Putin effectively neutralized an ally who became a little too powerful for Putin's liking. Most Russians perceived Shoigu as a familiar and respected minister who had served Russia honorably for 12 years. Putin also believed this before the invasion of Ukraine, sharing quite a close and public friendship with Shoigu. But as the situation in Ukraine worsened, the Russian public had to bid farewell to the many macho photos of Putin and Shoigu sunbathing bare-chested in Siberia, going on fishing trips and playing hockey. The choice between friendship and power proved to be an easy one for Putin. And that's precisely what the Russian political scientist Mikhail Sava believes Putin achieved by removing Shoigu from his cabinet. He removed any threat to his power. Shoigu's replacement, Belyusov, described as a trustworthy bureaucrat, is only interested in economic matters. He has no ambitions to lead the Russian armed forces, build a parallel power base, or even meddle in important military issues. The general staff of the Russian armed forces will be in charge of those, while Belyusov focuses on securing the necessary funding for Russia's war machine. Belyusov also doesn't have a loyal base of supporters like Shoigu. He's just a scientist who owes his position to Putin alone, and thus Putin alone warrants his loyalty. To secure this loyalty from other key figures in the cabinet, Putin started appointing their children to high-profile positions and lucrative state contracts. So Dmitry Patrushev, the son of Nikolai Patrushev, who many consider to be the second most powerful man in Russia, was appointed Deputy Prime Minister for Agriculture. Similarly, Boris Kovalchuk, the son of Yuri Kovalchuk, reputed to be Putin's personal banker, became the chairman of the Accounts Chamber of Russia. Through these moves, Putin is also securing the loyalty of the next generation of political leaders, eliminating future threats to his regime. Of course, there are no guarantees in the cruel world of politics, as Prigozhin proved, so Putin's efforts to fortify his position are fraught with risk. But even if they weren't, even if they were rock solid, the mere fact that Putin was forced to make these moves speaks volumes about his current state of mind. So do Putin's threats of nuclear war. Now, we know what you're thinking, old news. And yes, Putin has been threatening to deploy nuclear weapons virtually since the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion. However, the threats and this dangerous rhetoric dramatically intensified in the last few months, clearly showing just how desperate and panicked Putin is. In an effort to convince the world he isn't bluffing once again, he reiterated that Russia would use all means at its disposal to protect its sovereignty at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. He added, "For some reason, the West believes that Russia will never use it." Conveniently ignoring the very reason for this belief is his history of making empty threats and nuclear saber-rattling. Of course, Russian officials, state media, and publications are quick to take Putin's word for it, plastering nuclear threats across headlines and broadcasting them with fervor. But these threats aren't the only outlandish thing the Russian media keeps pushing. Believe it or not, Russia's state-controlled media outlets are now trying to convince Russian people to join the war by promising them that they will be resurrected if they get killed on the battlefield. Yep, you heard that right. The state media is also painting Russia's invasion as a holy war, presenting the Russian armed forces as the embodiment of the forces of good and describing individual soldiers as the forerunners of Jesus' forces. It's a lethal mix of delusion and desperation. However, in actuality, the desperation in this department is quite justified, given how many troops Russia has lost in Ukraine. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost as many as 570,120 troops. Combine this staggering number of casualties with the two waves of forced mobilization, 137,000 troops in August 2022 and 170,000 troops in December 2023, combined with the 300,000 Russian citizens who had fled the country, and it becomes obvious that the Kremlin is facing a dire manpower crisis. The fact that he's gradually running out of soldiers to send to certain death might have contributed to Putin's apparent readiness to hold peace talks, announced on June 14th. While this would surely be monumental news coming from any other warring leader, in Putin's case it's tinged with skepticism, especially when the terms Putin proposes for this peace initiative heavily favor Russia's strategic interests rather than offering any genuine concessions. According to him, fighting would stop if Ukraine would withdraw its troops from the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia oblasts and refuse to join NATO. Ukraine, on its part, slammed this proposition as an ultimatum, labeling his options for ending the war as absurd. Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs, also added that these statements contained nothing new. But Minister Kuleba is wrong. There is something new in Putin's June 14th statement, a hint of desperation. Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte was the first to point this out publicly. During the Global Peace Summit in Switzerland, Rutte said that Putin's alleged readiness to hold peace talks indicates that he's panicking. His exact words were, "Obviously, since he came up with this crazy proposal for peace yesterday, it shows us that he's panicking." However, Rutte still seems to believe peace is possible for the war in Ukraine and that it could be achieved at a similar summit. In fact, the Dutch official voiced his disappointment over Putin not attending the June 2024 summit in Switzerland, saying, "The train will not move without Russia." To be fair, Russia and Putin weren't invited to attend the Global Peace Summit, which ended up hosting about 100 delegations with 57 heads of state and governments from all over the world. However, the reason why Russia wasn't invited was the country's public flagging that it would not participate. But even if it did, it would hardly change anything. Putin needs the war in Ukraine to continue for his regime to survive. If the war comes to an end, regardless of the side that prevails, he will be left to grapple with the disastrous consequences of his war economy that Russians will no longer be able to ignore. Then again, Russians are already starting to catch on, despite the relentless propaganda keeping them in the dark. And they have a single item to thank, the first reason on our list for Putin to panic: eggs. That's right, eggs have come to symbolize the economic turmoil in Russia. They've become so expensive that they're even sold individually in some shops, going for as high as 23 cents an egg. Of course, they aren't alone, with numerous other basic ingredients soaring in price due to massive labor market shortages, high energy costs, and the plunging ruble. The situation has gotten so dire that Putin fears Russians might take to the streets to protest. This is also the first of many occurrences that set off Putin's panic mode, which we'll discuss in this video. In the same way Putin fears the rise of Kremlin rivals, he also fears the power of public unrest. That's why his regime ordered the Russian security services to take action and finally address the shocking prices and shortage of eggs and other staples. Russia is even resorting to importing eggs from Turkey and Azerbaijan to fill the gap, a stark contrast to the 98% of nationally sourced eggs before the war. Of course, eggs are far from the only reason why Putin is in full panic mode, and far from the most crucial one. That honor belongs to the second reason on our list, which is that Ukraine is now allowed to use Western-supplied weapons to strike targets on Russian soil. This monumental decision came in May 2024, when ally after ally started giving Ukraine the green light on the matter, instantly sending Putin into full panic mode. You see, before May, Ukraine was only allowed to use Western-supplied weapons on Russian targets within Ukrainian territory, that is, the parts occupied by Russia. This allowed Russia to wreak havoc all across Ukraine, while Ukraine was only allowed to respond within the confines of its own borders. With this new change of policy, Ukraine can use a wide variety of advanced weaponry to strike Russian targets beyond the occupied Ukrainian regions. However, there's also a major but involved. Ukraine can target Russian territory, but only within specific areas and military targets. For instance, the Russian armed forces launched a massive offensive in the Kharkiv region on May 10th, so the US allowed Ukraine to hit the Russian targets surrounding this border region, which were heavily involved in carrying out this offensive. Other countries like France, Germany, and the UK followed suit, allowing Ukraine to do the same with the weapons they supplied. But what kinds of weapons are we talking about here? Well, Ukraine can use most of its air defense systems, rockets, and artillery. Long-range missiles are still off limits, but this new policy shift opens up a range of high-impact options. To be more specific, Ukraine can now use the following weapons and equipment to strike predefined targets in Russia: the F-16 Fighting Falcon fighter jet supplied by the Netherlands and Denmark, Su-25 close air support jets donated by Northern Macedonia, Scalp Egg air-launched cruise missiles supplied by France, Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles delivered by the UK, the Bayraktar TB2 unmanned combat aerial vehicles provided by Turkey, and HIMARS and ATACMS missiles supplied by Germany, the US, UK, and Norway. Of course, the permission to use these weapons on Russian soil alone is by no means enough for Ukraine to win the war. However, it's more than enough to finally shift the balance of power and give Russia the taste of its own medicine. As an anonymous senior Ukrainian officer put it in a call with CNN, the Russian military can no longer feel impunity and security. The newly granted permission has already had a huge impact, allowing Ukraine to destroy several important targets inside Russia and conduct a successful counteroffensive. It's also stopped Russia from targeting the Kharkiv region with its S-300 and S-400 systems. How so? Ukraine started carrying out strikes on targets in the Belgorod region using the HIMARS missiles, which forced the Russians to move their surface-to-air missile systems much further away, putting ground targets in Kharkiv out of their range, that range being 75 miles for the S-300 system and 120 miles for its S-400 counterparts. As for the aerial targets like aircraft and missiles, both systems have an operational range of 250 miles. When struck by Ukrainian HIMARS, these systems were located roughly 40 miles from the front line in the Kharkiv region and 50 miles from the city of Kharkiv itself. Safeguarding Kharkiv from the S-300 threat has provided significant relief to the city of Kharkiv, which is also targeted by aerial glide bombs dropped from fighter jets from a distance of some 40 miles. However, there's one particular target that seems to be inducing the most panic in the Kremlin: the Crimean Bridge. As its name suggests, the 12-mile bridge is located on the Crimean Peninsula and serves as a crucial artery connecting the peninsula to mainland Russia. Since its construction in 2018, this bridge, also known as the Kerch Strait Bridge, has facilitated the movement of Russian troops, supplies, and resources between the peninsula and the mainland. However, the bridge has also served as a symbol of Russian control and a testament to Moscow's claims over Crimea, which makes it one of the prime targets for Ukrainian forces. So far, Ukraine has managed to hit the bridge twice, in October 2022 and July 2023. Both times, strike drones were involved in the attack. While these strikes managed to badly damage parts of the bridge, they failed to achieve Ukraine's ultimate goal, completely severing Russia's crucial supply line to Crimea. But the newly delivered ATACMS, a coveted long-range missile system manufactured in the US with a range of up to 190 miles, could change this. That's why the renewed flow of military aid from the US to Ukraine is another source of panic for Putin and the Kremlin, the third on our list. But how do we know Ukraine is eyeing the Crimean Bridge? Well, besides the obvious strategic value of this bridge, a senior Ukrainian diplomat has also dropped a major hint. In a post shared to X, formerly Twitter, Sergei Kyslytsya, Ukraine's permanent representative in the United Nations, listed 6 main types of bridges. Each of the types was accompanied by a diagram showing what the bridge type looks like. But in the 6th slot, there weren't any bridges, just an empty space with the words Kerch. For those who can read between the lines, the message was more than clear. The Kerch Bridge will be no more. The 4th reason for Putin's justified panic is the overall change in how the West approaches the war. For the better part of almost 30 months of warfare, the US and Western allies weren't going all in to help Ukraine. First, the West was wary of provoking Russia too much, fearing the escalation that might ensue. It's almost as if Ukraine wasn't allowed to win the war because of what a Russian loss might mean for the rest of Europe. Next, the West was seemingly hoping Putin would stop at some point, realizing that his aggressive expansionism would ultimately be unsustainable and self-defeating. This is also partially why the US waited for so long before greenlighting the use of its weapons inside Russia. Think of it this way: Ukraine doesn't want the war to continue, the US doesn't want the war to continue, NATO doesn't want the war to continue, and the rest of the world doesn't want the war to continue. It was only logical to assume that Russia could also be added to that list. Unfortunately, it became evident that Putin had no intention of stopping. In addition, he's obviously looking to expand the war beyond the Ukrainian borders. As a result, the West finally realized that a change of tactics was more than necessary. So the strategy is no longer Russia can't lose and Ukraine can't win. The strategy is now Ukraine will win the war. Ukrainian armed forces have seemingly sensed the change, lending them to fight more valiantly than ever. This leads us to the 5th source of Putin's panic: Ukraine's everlasting resilience. Even though Ukrainian forces are the ones heavily outgunned and outnumbered, the Russian troops are the ones taking more hits. According to Alexander Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, Russia suffers 3 times the number of casualties than Ukraine. In some areas, this ratio is even higher. Russia has also suffered heavy equipment losses since the beginning of the invasion. According to the July 24th report from the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost the following equipment in the war: 8,302 tanks, 16,013 armored fighting vehicles, 21,279 vehicles and fuel tanks, 15,759 artillery systems, 1,125 multiple launch rocket systems, 902 air defense systems, 363 airplanes, 326 helicopters, 12,544 drones, 28 ships and boats, 1 submarine. Of course, Ukraine has suffered heavy losses in this department as well, but not before taking full advantage of the equipment. For instance, a UK-based think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, estimated that Ukraine loses a staggering 10,000 drones monthly, but this high figure has to do with Ukraine's aggressive use of drones in combat roles. Simply put, Ukrainian drones have been wreaking havoc on Russia. They are the reason the Black Sea Fleet has all but retreated from Crimea, despite standing against a country that has virtually no navy. Ukraine has also been using drones to sow panic and fear across Russia, wiping out major targets in the process. The targets in question are mostly air bases, oil depots, and industrial sites. In other words, locations whose destruction can disrupt Putin's relentless war machine. In one of the latest attacks, 47 drones targeted the Rostov region, badly damaging the Morozovsk airbase, home to various Russian fighter jets, including Su-34s, Su-24s, and Su-24Ms. The 5 areas that were hit were the location of an S-300-400 air defense system, the parking area of an Su-24 fighter jet, another parking area for fighter jets, a fuel and lubricants warehouse, and the runway. With strategic moves aimed at appeasing the people of Russia and its government, it's clear that Ukraine remains the biggest threat to the survival of Putin's regime. After all, we're talking about a man who takes out his opponents almost preemptively before they get a real chance to threaten his grip on power. Think Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny. So the fact that this great enemy of Russia, Ukraine, just won't relent and continues to challenge his authority is a source of profound anxiety for Putin. The same goes for his many miscalculations in the war in Ukraine, the 6th source of panic. Remember, the very invasion of Ukraine was launched based on a miscalculation. Putin's yes men promised him that he could take Kyiv in 3 days or so after swarming it with 190,000 troops and tens of thousands of vehicles. Of course, this didn't happen. Kyiv is still very much standing. Since the beginning of the invasion, there has been one miscalculation after another, and even Putin, despite his usual arrogance, can't ignore the mounting evidence of his errors. Speaking of his miscalculations, another international one is sure to make Putin sweat: Joe Biden dropping out of the 2024 US presidential race. You see, Putin was all but convinced that Donald Trump would get re-elected in November, as his opponent was widely painted as an old and sickly man who can't be trusted to lead the most powerful nation in the world. Of course, this worked in Putin's favor, as Trump famously promised to shake up NATO, even threatening to pull the US from the alliance altogether. With a weakened NATO, Putin would have little trouble advancing his strategic ambitions, both in Ukraine and beyond. But Putin's dreams of an easy path to victory were shattered on July 21, 2024, when it was announced that Biden would no longer run for re-election and that he endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris, as his replacement. The news stirred up quite the commotion in the US and the rest of the world, Russia very much included. Russian state officials started complaining on national TV that Biden's move was a disaster for Trump's re-election chances. As Oleg Matveyev, a member of the State Duma, put it, previously, Trump could easily attack Biden's health. Now he has nothing left to attack. He added that Trump's campaign switched to attacking Harris, but nothing new will stick to her. Of course, the US presidential race is far from over, but it's easy to see why Putin and those around him are panicking. If elected, Harris's policy toward Ukraine is likely to remain similar to Biden's, which means support for as long as it takes. Harris has previously attended 3 consecutive Munich security conferences, meeting with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky at each. Though her first appearance was 5 days before the full-scale invasion started, Harris used the other 2 meetings with Zelensky to reiterate US support for Ukraine. Harris has also continuously reiterated that Russia must pay for its war crimes, which shouldn't be surprising, given her background as Attorney General. She also insists that the only way for the war in Ukraine to end is with Ukraine as a nation that is free, democratic, and independent. So there you have it. Putin's full panic mode now makes much more sense, doesn't it? But the good news is that the West still has a few cards up its sleeve, which could easily push Putin into an even deeper state of desperation. The first is to allow Ukraine to hit more targets using Western-supplied weapons. Though lifting all limitations is the ultimate goal, even a simple expansion beyond areas directly targeting Ukraine would do wonders for the country's war effort. Ideally, Ukraine should be able to hit Moscow, because there's no more important city in the entire country. Russia is Moscow, and Moscow is Russia. For now, the people of Moscow are mostly unaware of the war raging some 500 miles away. Sure, they've experienced the fluctuating economy, but they have no idea of the full scale of devastation and chaos unfolding in Ukraine. The Russian elites were a bit shaken when the war first started, but by now they're used to it, giving it no second thought in their day-to-day lives. So the only way to truly get to Putin is to make Russia feel the war. As the Ukrainian historian Yuri Felshtinsky puts it, Felshtinsky believes that it's also the only way to ultimately defeat Russia and prevent further escalation. The West, and the US in particular, can also instill more fear in Putin by providing additional military aid to Ukraine. After all, in the 5 months when US aid was withheld was when Russia turned the tables. Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are vocal about the massive impact this aid has. In the words of an officer with the 148th Artillery Brigade, "We can see the impact of the aid every day. Artillery, longer-range multiple-launch rocket systems with various types of ammunition and submunitions, it's affecting the overall battlefield picture." The last thing that the West can do to make Putin sweat doesn't have anything to do directly with Ukraine. It refers to changing the regime in Belarus, Russia's only remaining ally in the region. While Alexander Lukashenko is in power, Putin will continue using Belarus as a starting point for his military operations in the region, potentially advancing against the entirety of Europe. Recently, Putin even moved part of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons arsenal to Belarus, suggesting that the first nuclear strikes could be launched from this territory. Defeating Putin while the war is still limited to only Ukraine is the only way to prevent a World War III-like escalation, and taking Lukashenko out of the picture would certainly help achieve that goal. Of course, there's always the question of what Putin will do if he's backed into a corner. As of 2024, Russia possesses 5,850 nuclear warheads, the most in the world, which is why a nuclear war is the first thing to come to mind when thinking of a potential escalation. It doesn't help that Putin has been rather cavalier about the potential use of these weapons, leaving the rest of the world in just as much panic as he's currently experiencing. But what do you think? Is there a way to push Putin to the edge without provoking World War III? And if so, what do you think will be the straw that breaks the camel's back? Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Russia had the world convinced that it had the second strongest military in the world, inferior only to the United States. But as the dust of the war settled, it became increasingly clear that the mighty bear was merely a paper tiger. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, said it the best in a speech in Finland. The Kremlin often claimed it had the second strongest military in the world, and many believed it. Today, many see Russia's military as the second strongest in Ukraine. A case study in failure, that's how Blinken labeled the Russians, and the country's equipment, technology, leadership, troops, strategy, tactics, and morale. Increasingly, these aspects of the Russian military Blinken singled out almost perfectly match the very reasons Russia's military is weaker than you think. The reasons we'll discuss in this video. But before diving into these critical factors, let's examine how the illusion of a mighty Russian military might be constructed. The explanation is simple. It's all about appearances. Many people view the Russian military as the successor to the Soviet war machine, a force of sheer numbers and unyielding might. Remember, the Soviet Union was the one to spend over 20% of its gross domestic product, GDP, during the Cold War era to keep up with the image of a military colossus that could crush any adversary through sheer attrition and brutal efficiency. But appearances can be deceiving, and as the vestige of the Soviet legacy, Russia inherited more than just the image. It also inherited the underlying weaknesses. The weakness has now been exposed for the world to see, as the brittle core of the Russian military, previously masked by hollow bravado, cracked and crumbled when put to the test in Ukraine. So let's inspect each of these cracks that have caused the facade of the Russian military to crumble under the weight of its own overestimation. The first crack is arguably the most obvious. The Russian military has simply lost too many troops in Ukraine, weakening the very fiber of its operational readiness. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, Russia has lost as many as 561,400 troops between February 24, 2022 and July 16, 2024. That's more than 500,000 soldiers in a little over 2 years. The last time such devastating losses were seen was during World War II, when nations mobilized on an unprecedented scale. But in June 2024, Russia's President Vladimir Putin said that almost 700,000 Russian troops were fighting in Ukraine. So how weak can the Russian military possibly be, even after all these heavy losses? Well, first of all, does anyone really believe Putin's claims anymore, after they've been proven wrong time and again? But for argument's sake, let's say those figures aren't grossly overestimated. This begs the question, where are all these troops coming from? Because the Russian military casualties are very much real, and the country's armed forces comprised roughly 900,000 troops and officers before the invasion, so something definitely doesn't add up. The element missing in this calculation is conscription. In August 2022, Putin signed a decree to increase the number of Russian troops by 137,000. In December 2023, he ordered another 170,000 fighters to be added. If Sergei Shoigu, the now sacked long-standing Minister of Defense, is to be believed, almost 490,000 contract soldiers and volunteers joined the army in 2023 alone. Though he presents these figures through a lens of heroism and dedication, they probably have more to do with the generous pay and benefits offered to attract recruits. Namely, it's been reported that the Russian contract troops are paid at least 210,000 rubles per month, approximately $2,300, to fight Putin's war. That's over 3 times more than the average Russian salary, which was 71,419 rubles in July 2023. So it's possible that Russia does have the numbers when it comes to troops. But as you'll soon learn, numbers are all the country has. You see, many of the Russian military's most elite personnel perished in the opening weeks of the full-scale conflict in Ukraine. The new conscripts can in no way replace the expertise and battle-hardened experience of those troops, especially not when they're only conscripted for a year, most of which they spend in training. However, the more troops died in Ukraine, the shorter this training period and the more desperate Russian mobilization efforts became. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW for short, reported that Russia even tried to draft new troops inside Ukraine by conducting a door-to-door mobilization effect in Kadivka and forcing residents of Luhansk into joining the military through extortion and threats. And that's on top of the 100,000 dangerous prison inmates Russia freed to fight in Ukraine and the many ill-prepared draftees in Putin's partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists. Drafting these reservists was such a huge mistake that even Putin admitted to it during a video call with his advisors, expressing his regret for drafting individuals with chronic illnesses, people too old to fight, and fathers with children. But this regret will do little to mitigate the severe consequences of such hasty and flawed mobilization efforts and appease the growing discontent within Russian troops, especially as it's becoming more evident that Russia still treats its troops as the Soviet Union treated the T-34 tank during World War II, as expendable assets. The T-34 was cheap to build, which allowed the Red Army to mass-produce them and send them to be destroyed. Similarly, Russia continues to send its soldiers into harm's way without any regard for their safety, seeing them as nothing more than pawns. In both cases, it seems that the prevailing sentiment was and is, hey, we can always get some more. As you can expect, this willingness to sacrifice Russian lives and conduct attrition warfare at a cost no Western country would ever accept hasn't really made the Russian troops fond of their service of their mission. This brings us to the second crack in the facade of the Russian military: the exceedingly low morale, fueled by a sense of expendability, the outright horrific treatment by the government, and the grim realities of war. In August 2023, a small group of Russian soldiers stationed in the Kherson region recorded a video in which they described their morale as being below floor level. According to the independent media organization translating war materials into English, War Translated, which shared and obviously translated the video, these soldiers complained about being sent to the first line of defense without proper training, air support, artillery support, and without heavy equipment. This video is on par with the November 2022 assessment by the ISW, which indicated that the morale and psychological state of Russian forces in the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts were exceedingly low, due to high losses on the battlefield, troop desertion, and inadequate preparation for battle. All things considered, it shouldn't be surprising that the abuse of methamphetamines and other drugs is on the rise among the Russian military, according to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, a US government-funded media organization. The horrible treatment that caused such catastrophic consequences is also part of the third crack in the Russian military's perceived strength: the sheer lack of battlefield tactics and strategic foresight. So far, the only tactic the Russian forces have heavily relied on was the infamous meat grinder strategy. This strategy is exactly what it sounds like. Ill-prepared and ill-equipped troops are sent in en masse into combat in an effort to overwhelm the Ukrainian front lines. There's no regard for casualties or strategic objectives. The sheer unfiltered aggression, akin to feeding soldiers directly into the relentless meat grinder of battle. At first glance, this approach can make the Russian army appear formidable in its unyielding push forward. But upon closer inspection, it becomes clear this army is virtually gaining no ground while suffering devastating losses. A similar approach can be seen across all the other theaters. It seems that Russia is hell-bent on completely obliterating Ukraine, but in reality, it's only eroding its own military strength. The heavy losses in the military equipment department only further prove this. These losses also represent another reason why Russia's military is much weaker than you think: the fourth crack. According to the July 16th report by the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces, Russia has lost the following equipment since the invasion began: 8,227 tanks, 15,862 armored fighting vehicles, 20,680 vehicles and fuel tanks, 15,368 artillery systems, 1,119 multiple launch rocket systems, 892 air defense systems, 361 airplanes, 326 helicopters, 12,193 drones, 28 ships and boats, and 1 submarine. Those are heavy losses for the military that was supposed to crush Kyiv in a few days, as was initially planned. Russia might have started the war with an overwhelming number of weapons and equipment, but most of these were soon proven to be far inferior to their Western-made counterparts. Take the Kamov Ka-52 attack helicopter, nicknamed the Alligator, as an example. Before the invasion, military experts considered the Ka-52 as one of the most capable aircraft of its kind. This twin-seat helicopter is an immensely upgraded form of the original Kamov Ka-50 Black Shark aircraft, which used a single-seat cockpit. Thanks to the upgrades, the Ka-52 is billed as a platform able to take on various roles, including assault, close air support, convoy protection, and armed patrols. All of this while retaining a maximum speed of nearly 190 miles per hour, a cruising speed of nearly 160 miles per hour, a ferry range of almost 700 miles, a combat radius of 285 miles, and an operational service ceiling of 18,000 feet. And yet the supposedly inferior Ukrainian forces have managed to down over 80 of these $16 million worth combat helicopters, which is reportedly half of the Russian total Ka-52 fleet. It is a case study in failure. The almost effortless destruction of the Ka-52 helicopters made the retired US Army General Ben Hodges question the competence of the entire Russian military, including the equipment and the personnel in charge of it. After a Ka-52 was shot down in the Zaporizhia region by the 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade and the incident captured on video, Hodges stated that the Russian pilot clearly lacked the skills to fly his attack helicopter. But incompetence in the Russian military doesn't stop there. It goes all the way to the top, to the military leadership itself, which makes for the fifth crack in Russia's perceived military might. Chaos, dysfunction, corruption. Call it what you will, any of those words best capture the state of Russian military leadership today. Although truthfully, this has always been the case with the Russian top brass. But the invasion of Ukraine showed just how rotten the core of the Russian military hierarchy truly is. The event that single-handedly proved this was the firing of Sergei Shoigu, who held the position of Russian defense minister for 12 years. Though this move was anticipated for some time, it was still shocking given how close Shoigu was to Putin. So why did Putin decide to boot his longtime confidant? Well, there are a few possible reasons for this highly consequential decision, including the overall poor performance of the Russian military in Ukraine and his personal feud with Yevgeny Prigozhin, the late head of the Wagner Group, which culminated in the infamous June 2023 Wagner rebellion. However, the primary reason why Shoigu had to go was his reported involvement in embezzlement schemes. As The Diplomat, an international online magazine covering politics in the Indo-Pacific region, puts it, the present-day weakness also shows what happens when you let one person, Sergei Shoigu, steal most of the defense budget. So if the one person whose job it is to ensure military readiness and capability only cares about lining his own pockets, how strong can that military truly be? The answer is painfully clear: not strong at all. Shoigu's departure isn't just a change in leadership, it's an indictment of a system riddled with corruption and incompetence, a system that has failed its soldiers and its nation. Another aspect that has failed the Russian military, leaving it vulnerable and exposed, is the state-run defense industry, aka the sixth reason why Russia's military is weaker than initially thought. This industry, once a symbol of Soviet power, has now become a relic of inefficiency and outdated technology. Plagued by mismanagement and corruption, it can no longer produce the advanced weaponry and equipment necessary to sustain a modern military force. Instead of innovation, there's stagnation. Instead of strength, there's vulnerability. This decrepit system has failed to keep pace with global advancements, leaving Russia's military exposed and underprepared for the challenges of contemporary warfare. Sure, Putin has recently ramped up the defense industry significantly, producing numerous artillery rounds, missiles, and drones, but the damage has already been done. The years of neglect and corruption can't be undone overnight. The new production may bolster numbers, but it can't mask the underlying weakness. However, even this so-called new production isn't always exactly new. What do we mean by that? Well, there's simply not enough time to produce new weapons at the rate Russia wants and, let's face it, needs. So the industry has resorted to dipping into its Soviet-era stocks and cannibalizing old equipment to keep up appearances. This is also the seventh and last crack in Russia's facade of strength, which has crumbled under scrutiny. In a way, the final reason why Russia's military is weaker than you think is the same as the first reason we mentioned. Sure, Russia might have exorbitant numbers of troops on paper, but these troops are poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and lacking in morale, a stark contrast to the elite units once boasted of by the Kremlin. Similarly, Russia might brag about high production figures, such as the reported 2,100 tanks manufactured in 2023, ranging from T-55 to T-62 to the latest T-90. But how many of these tanks have been taken out of storage, minimally refurbished, and sent to get destroyed on the battlefield? Quite a few, according to the Swedish Defense Research Agency. The same agency estimated that Russia produced only 520 new tanks in 2023, including 62 T-90M Proyevs, 62 T-90 T-90As, 80 T-80 BVMs, 140 T-72 B3s, and 140 T-72 B3Ms. So Russia might still have ungodly quantities of weapons and equipment, but these are subpar at best, bound to fail in modern combat. To make matters worse for Russia, these stocks can't last forever. In fact, they will only last to mid-2025, according to recent projections by a Ukrainian intelligence and analytical platform with a name that roughly translates to the military fortune teller. Naturally, the vehicles from these stocks, built during the Soviet Union's industrial heyday, can't be replaced with new production, which signifies more than just a logistical challenge. It represents a fundamental crisis in Russia's defense capability. For this reason, many experts believe that the Russian military is running out of time in Ukraine. The only thing it can do is turn to foreign imports from North Korea, Iran, and China, as it's already done during the invasion, eroding Russia's self-sufficiency and sovereignty in matters of national security. And a military that isn't self-sufficient is anything but strong. There you have it, the 7 aspects of Russian military power in Ukraine, where claims are one thing but reality is quite another. These 7 aspects reveal a military stretched thin, reliant on outdated equipment and foreign imports, plagued by corruption and incompetence, and struggling to maintain morale and readiness among its ranks. What if we told you that the current state of the Russian military was only partially to do with Ukraine? The truth is that the Russian military was always bound to fail, thanks to deep-seated weaknesses that long predate the invasion we've already mentioned. Coincidentally, these weaknesses also span 7 critical categories. So let's go through another list of reasons that made the Russian military weak in the first place. Many of them have directly caused the 7 cracks we discussed in this video. The first among them is the stubborn unwillingness to decentralize decision-making authority, symptomatic for over 5 centuries of Russian autocracy. As a result of the centralized decision-making, the Russian military has often been slow to adapt to changing circumstances and respond to dynamic threats and opportunities. It's also why Russia lacks an effective non-commissioned officer (NCO) corps, critical for effective battlefield management. Without a robust NCO corps, which serves as the backbone of many modern military forces, Russia struggles to delegate authority and responsibility effectively across its ranks, resulting in inefficiencies, poor coordination, and a lack of initiative among its personnel. But why does Russia cling to centralized decision-making if it does its military more harm than good? It's simple really, it's all the country has ever known. In Russia's long history, the power has always been concentrated in the hands of a single ruler, immune to external checks or popular control. This autocratic tradition has also shaped the country's military culture, which became focused on rigid adherence to orders rather than open communication and individual rights. In other words, the Russian military system has to be compatible with autocracy to avoid undermining it. That's why the Russian military has never properly trained NCOs to serve to mentor officers and teach the enlisted soldiers or empower them in any way. Since their role was virtually non-existent, the number of Russian NCOs throughout history has also been negligible. For instance, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Imperial Russian Army only had about 2 senior NCOs per company among its 12,000 long-service soldiers. For comparison's sake, the German companies of the same era had 12. So Russian companies couldn't execute any sophisticated maneuvers that required extensive coordination. It was all about sending soldiers forward en masse, regardless of how vulnerable they were. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Another deep-rooted weakness in the Russian military that's alive and well today is the lack of accurate information within the military ranks. Famously, Putin chose to storm Ukraine based on inaccurate intelligence, which guaranteed Kyiv would crumble in a matter of days. Unfortunately, we all know the horrific consequences of this miscalculation. Again, the inability to foster honest communication within the military and the government stems from a deeply entrenched autocratic tradition where centralized control is paramount to maintaining political power. The Kremlin relies on propaganda and coercion to suppress dissent and ensure conformity, perpetuating a culture where truthful communication is discouraged and dissenting voices are silenced or punished. Such an environment can only stifle accurate intelligence gathering and analysis, exemplified by the flawed intelligence that influenced Russia's decision to invade Ukraine. In addition, this historical precedent of conforming intelligence to fit Kremlin narratives has reached virtually every aspect of the war in Ukraine, perpetuating a cycle where information is manipulated or suppressed to maintain the ruling regime's perception of reality. That's probably why Putin and his lapdogs still believe Russia is the second strongest military in the world. It's also why these same people managed to severely underestimate Ukrainian resistance and Western resolve, which ultimately all but destroyed the country's military. Unsurprisingly, this is another part of its military heritage, the third we'll discuss: Russia's imperialist ideology. The imperial lens through which information is filtered in Russia perpetuates a culture of conformity and misinformation, shaping policies that underestimate opponents and overestimate Russia's capabilities. Throw selective historical interpretations and dismissal of alternative narratives into the mix, and it becomes clear how Putin has been living in his own little bubble for so long. It also becomes clear why he sent his troops into Ukraine, believing that there would be no opposition waiting for them. After all, Ukraine is Russian, and Ukrainians are Russians, right? Not even close. But what is undoubtedly Russian is the reliance on brutality to maintain control. The fourth deep-seated reason the Russian military is weaker than you think. The brutality ingrained in Russian military culture stems from a history of autocratic control and state violence, spanning from Tsarist institutions like Ivan IV's Oprichnina to Soviet-era organizations like the Cheka and KGB. Between 1971 and 1991 alone, an estimated 61 million people died in the Soviet Union as a direct result of state murders, mass deportations, and the Gulag system. This legacy has perpetuated a system where political dissent is suppressed through terror and violence, reflected in the harsh treatment of both civilians and soldiers. This pattern continued through conflicts like the Afghan and Chechen wars, where coercive tactics targeted populations to enforce government control, often with devastating humanitarian consequences. In Afghanistan, this approach resulted in 1.5 million civilians killed and another 6 million banished from the country. Corruption and neglect within the Russian military exacerbate these issues, leaving soldiers poorly equipped and subjected to systematic abuse, such as dedovshchina, a form of brutal hazing tolerated by officers to maintain discipline. The resulting impact on morale and unit cohesion undermines combat effectiveness, as soldiers lack trust in leadership. Again, quite a familiar scenario. This environment not only brutalizes Russian soldiers but also fosters a culture of disregard for international norms, evident in war crimes committed against Ukrainian civilians. After all, if they themselves were brutalized, why not take it out on someone even weaker? A terrible mindset, but one very much evident from the Russian military's conduct. Another factor that's contributed to this pitiful state of the Russian troops is corruption. Now, we've already mentioned corruption when discussing ineffective military leadership, but this factor is so endemic to the Russian military that it warrants specific attention. Corruption in Russia has deep historical roots, stemming from Tsarist autocracy through Soviet communism and into the present era under Putin. This pervasive corruption permeates all levels of society, including the military, severely impacting combat readiness and morale. Russian soldiers have historically suffered from embezzlement of salaries, inadequate equipment due to theft and black market sales, and logistical failures worsened by corrupt practices. Even during conflicts like the First Chechen War and operations in the Balkans, corruption plagued military operations, with soldiers selling weapons and supplies to enemies or for personal profit. Today, despite reforms and increased oversight, corruption remains endemic, affecting over 80% of defense construction contracts and compromising combat effectiveness. That's why Russia is ranked 141st out of 180 countries on the Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index, down 4 spots since 2022 despite the supposed reforms. For comparison's sake, the US ranks 24th on the list, which is the same spot it held in 2022. A list where Russia undoubtedly ranks better is the list of countries by nominal GDP, where it ranks among the top 15 in the world. However, it was only when Putin fired Shoigu and replaced him with Andrei Belyusov, an economist, that Russia truly placed its economy on a war footing. Previously, the Russian economy was seriously neglected for years, which is the 6th underlying reason for the weakening of the Russian military. After all, a robust economy has always been necessary to sustain any military effort. All Russia did historically was heavily rely on fluctuating oil and gas revenues, which hindered diversification into other sectors and left the economy vulnerable to global energy market shifts. Of course, there's also rampant corruption, bureaucratic inefficiencies, lack of reforms, and insufficient investment in education and healthcare, all collectively weakening Russia's economy and, in turn, Russia's military. The seventh and final underlying reason for how truly weak the Russian military has become is the inherent difficulties in its plan to conquer Ukraine. Even if none of the previously mentioned reasons had been a factor, a swift invasion would have still been nearly impossible to pull off. After all, we're talking about some 190,000 troops and tens of thousands of vehicles navigating an urban area in the dead of winter with almost no air support due to the bad weather and lighting conditions. It was simply too challenging to quickly storm Kyiv, the seventh most populous city in Europe, with 3.5 million residents occupying 324 square miles, before Ukraine and its allies got the chance to react effectively. Of course, as we now know, this reaction was also one of the triggers of the downfall of the Russian military, which is practically fighting itself at this point. However, even with all these weaknesses, military experts aren't quick to write off the Russian military for a few reasons. One, Russia has demonstrated an outright shocking ability to adapt and innovate in response to challenges. Two, Russia's weaknesses are far from the only factor necessary for Ukraine to prevail. And three, a weak Russia is still very much dangerous globally, perhaps even more, as a wounded animal is known to be unpredictable and violent. But what do you think? Is this the beginning of the end for the Russian military, or is it merely a temporary setback? And if Ukraine is to capitalize on all these weaknesses, how should it go about it? The war in Ukraine wasn't supposed to go like this. It was meant to be a quick invasion, over in a matter of weeks, that would allow Russia's President Vladimir Putin to take territory that he believes should have been Russia's all along. It almost worked. Russia managed to fight to the edges of Kyiv before being pushed back. Ukraine's resistance was stronger than he expected. But no matter, his soldiers could regroup, consolidate their gains, and then push again with renewed force. Except that's not what happened. In addition to Ukraine fighting more fervently than Putin could ever anticipate, support came pouring into the country from all over the world. Suddenly, the small Ukrainian military was being bolstered by modern weapons that enabled it to fight more effectively against Russia. As of May 2024, Ukraine has managed to reclaim 54% of the territory that Russia captured during its initial invasion, leaving Russia occupying just 18% of the country. The war is now one of attrition. If Russia does manage to win, it'll achieve a Pyrrhic victory for a simple reason. The war has become a meat grinder for Russian soldiers, a meat grinder that's so intense that Russia now finds itself losing up to 1,000 soldiers per day as Putin's approach devolves into sending more and more people to the front in the hope of overwhelming Ukraine's forces. That brings us to the question we'll answer in this video. Why is this happening? How has Russia gone from nearly taking Ukraine within a few weeks to getting locked into a war in which it's losing so many soldiers daily? To answer that simple question, we must first dig into the reports that claim Russia is losing so many of its people. Toward the end of June 2024, Business Insider published an article in which it went into depth about Russia's current rate of losses. Quoting the New York Times, it says that officials from the UK, US, and other Western intelligence agencies all agree that Russia's approach of attacking Ukraine's defenses head-on is costing them 1,000 soldiers per day. The UK believes it may even be higher, placing Russia's losses at 1,200 soldiers per day in May 2024. These are the highest numbers that have been reported since the beginning of the war, and they're adding up. The UK believes that Russia has lost 500,000 soldiers to death or injury since February 2022. The US is a bit more conservative in its estimates. It places the number at 350,000. But either way, it's clear that Russia has lost far more soldiers than it planned to lose. After all, the country had called up 300,000 reservists to its army in September 2022. Whichever figure is correct, that reserve force has almost been entirely depleted. The reports come amidst Russia intensifying its attacks on Ukrainian positions in the Kharkiv region. Ukraine's second largest city is a key target for Putin, both strategically and symbolically. On the latter front, Russia would score a major propaganda victory over Ukraine by taking its second city, dealing a blow to Ukrainian morale in the process. It could build from this victory, reinforcing the notion that nothing can stop its military from taking Kyiv. At the very least, taking Kharkiv means Putin will be in an even stronger position should negotiations for a ceasefire commence. On the more practical side, Kharkiv is home to Ukraine's largest natural gas reserves, meaning the region is key to keeping Ukraine self-sustaining on the energy front. It's also a major contributor to Ukraine's economy. It was Ukraine's third largest contributor to gross domestic product in 2019, accounting for 6.3%. That places it behind only Dnipropetrovsk and Kyiv in terms of its economic importance. Putin really wants Kharkiv. To claim it, he's willing to throw soldier after soldier at Ukrainian fortifications, with seemingly no regard for the number who are killed. Also reporting on the New York Times article, the Kyiv Independent shares a key quote. "It is a style of warfare that Russian soldiers have likened to being put into a meat grinder, with commanding officers seemingly oblivious to the fact that they are sending infantry soldiers to die." All of this brings us back to the question we posed at the beginning of the video. Why is this happening? There are several answers to that question, starting with the most important. Throwing soldier after soldier at a problem has worked for Russia before, so Putin believed that it would work again when he tried to take Kharkiv. Take the Battle of Avdiivka as an example. Russia waged that battle between October 10, 2023 and February 17, 2024. That's a total of 130 days in which Russia took much the same approach to taking the fortified town as it's taking in Kharkiv, throw soldier after soldier at it. Estimates vary on how many men Russia lost when taking Avdiivka, with Business Insider quoting a Russian military blogger as claiming the number was somewhere in the region of 16,000, along with 300 armored vehicles. Ukraine's military says the number is much higher. It claims Russia lost 47,000 soldiers when trying to take Avdiivka. That amounts to losses of around 360 per day. Granted, that's not as high as what we're seeing as Russia tries to take Kharkiv. However, Avdiivka is a much smaller territory, meaning Putin appears to have simply scaled up his approach because he's seen the meat grinder work before. The battle for Bakhmut was just as damaging to Russia. Though Russia was able to declare victory in May 2023, after fighting to claim the city for close to a year, it lost thousands of soldiers in the process. Newsweek reported that Russia lost around 100,000 soldiers in just 4 months while making its final push for the city, meaning that it would have landed close to the 1,000 per day mark that it's hitting now as it tries to take Kharkiv. And it wasn't just Russian military personnel who lost their lives. Mercenary groups also saw heavy losses. That's according to Wagner's Yevgeny Prigozhin, who claimed that his group lost 20,000 men in the fighting. Still, Russia took Bakhmut and Avdiivka. And in doing so, it established that the meat grinder approach worked. Throwing soldier after soldier at Ukraine's fortifications eventually wore them down, to the point where Ukraine had to retreat. A pair of Pyrrhic victories perhaps, but victories nonetheless. Russia's approach in Kharkiv may mirror that seen in these two battles for the simple fact that it gets results, albeit results that come at a massive cost of life. But there's a problem. The meat grinder approach doesn't appear to be working as well in Kharkiv. As the Kyiv Independent reported in June 2024, months of meat grinding have seen Russia make very little progress in Kharkiv. While Russia managed to achieve its objective of creating a buffer zone along the border between Russia and Kharkiv, making it more difficult for Ukraine to attack Russian territory in the process, it's barely progressed in the region. In fact, Ukraine managed to halt Russia's offensive in June, with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg summing up the situation. They tried and they failed. They made very small gains and they are paying a very high price. The Kyiv Independent also notes that Russia's use of wave infantry tactics, such as those seen in Avdiivka and Bakhmut, has been one of its biggest advantages in the war. Russia's population is much larger than Ukraine's, and it has a larger military, meaning it also has a bigger pool of recruits. However, the sheer rate of casualties has also forced Russia into sending inadequately trained soldiers to the front lines. Remember that point, it will be important later. For now, Putin seems happy to just throw wave after wave of soldiers at Kharkiv, which brings us to the second reason Russia is losing 1,000 soldiers per day. Putin doesn't seem to care how many soldiers he loses as long as he wins. That lack of regard for his own people is demonstrated by Putin's willingness to use ex-convicts as soldiers in Russia's army. In an October 2023 report, Euronews made this abundantly clear when talking about two men, Denis Stepanov and Vladimir V. The former had been arrested for burning down a house in Siberia, killing 2 women in the process. As for the latter, he'd entered a drunken argument with his wife that escalated into a brawl. That fight continued to get worse until Vladimir V struck and killed his wife's 4-year-old daughter. What does this have to do with Putin's disregard for his people? Both men were former members of the Wagner mercenary group, which Putin has been more than happy to send to the front lines in Ukraine. Euronews calls this the tip of the iceberg, noting that members of this group have been accused of war crimes ranging from murder to rape and robbery of Ukrainian citizens. It also has a track record of torturing and executing those who attempt to desert the war. That brutality sums up what Wagner has brought to the Ukraine war. Its former leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, supposedly hired thousands of convicts to bolster his ranks. Each was promised a pardon in exchange for their service, though, as we learned earlier, around 20,000 of them died in the assault on Bakhmut. Putin approves of using convicts to fight against Ukraine, saying in September 2022 that those who fight have redeemed themselves in the eyes of himself and Russian society. Everyone can make some mistakes, they once did, Putin claimed, but they gave their lives for the motherland and fully redeemed themselves. Giving their lives is precisely what these former convicts did. Several who spoke of their experiences in Bakhmut said that Russian soldiers were being killed like mosquitoes, while another claiming that he kept a grenade in his vest so that he could detonate it whenever he was captured by Ukraine's troops. In all cases, these convicts were sent into the meat grinder because Putin simply didn't care enough about who he was sending into Ukraine or what they did when they got there. He also didn't care enough for his own people back home to ensure they were protected from the convicts who returned. By granting them full pardons for fighting in Ukraine, he placed Russian citizens at risk. Euronews highlighted at least 2 instances where returning soldiers killed Russian civilians. None of it matters to Putin as long as he wins the war. The Hill also dug into Putin's recruitment tactics in a November 2023 article. It claims that while there are surely soldiers in Russia's military who are fighting due to patriotism and belief in Putin's cause, many more fight simply because they believe they have no other choice. They're not wrong. Putin has ramped punishments for those who refuse to fight or surrender voluntarily while in Ukraine. Each faces imprisonment of up to 10 years for their actions, meaning Putin is so intent on getting as many people into Ukraine as he can that he's willing to ruin the lives of those who don't wish to join his war. The punishment situation is so bad that October 2023 saw US officials claiming that Russia was executing soldiers who attempted to retreat during the Avdiivka offensive. The message being sent to soldiers is clear: die fighting Ukraine or be killed by Russia itself. There's also a racist element to Putin's recruitment. That's according to The Hill, which claims that Russia's general staff overwhelmingly forces its recruitment efforts on non-ethnic Russian regions, which are typically languishing in poverty due to their separation from the Russian mainland. The rationale here is that Russia can recruit from these regions by promising money, suggesting Putin believes he can buy his way to forcing people to sacrifice their lives for his cause. It all adds up to a leader who is willing to send anybody to die on Ukraine's front lines, which brings us back to Russia losing 1,000 people per day. Putin doesn't care. His country contains enough people for him to simply be able to replace those Russia loses. Russia's leader has shown he's willing to use ex-convicts to win his war, regardless of the long-term ramifications, and that he will imprison those who he conscripts if they refuse to fight. He's also hiring anybody from anywhere as long as they'll fight for Russia. It's a combination of a ragtag approach to keeping his military stocked and a dictatorial approach to the war. Russians will fight for Russia because Putin commands it. They will die for Russia for the same reason. This complete lack of regard for the fate of thousands of soldiers Putin sends to the front lines also has a knock-on effect that brings us to our third reason why Russia is losing 1,000 soldiers per day: training. Or rather, the lack thereof, and the impact that poor training has on Russia's military and its ability to carry out effective operations. Opinions on Russia's military training standards have circulated since the Ukraine war began, though they intensified as the war entered its second year. In May 2023, Newsweek published an article examining a British intelligence assessment that claimed Russia's ground forces were primarily made up of poorly trained mobilized reservists. In other words, the 300,000 conscripts Putin forced onto the front lines in September 2022. The report also notes that these reservists are being forced to use antiquated equipment, leaving them in a position where they're practically untrained and have weapons on which they can't rely. Combining this inadequate training with the loss of many of its elite brigades during the early months of the war means Russia has operational problems. Its veterans are dying off, leaving poorly trained reservists to take over. Those reservists' lack of training means they're less capable of carrying out complex operations, meaning they're more than likely to be killed or wounded on the front lines. The sheer number of deaths Russia is experiencing has even forced it to change how it trains its soldiers. That's according to a December 2023 Newsweek report, which says Russia is changing its methods to prepare its recruits for intense combat operations they'll face on the front lines. The report notes that Russia has lost up to 87% of its initial active-duty ground troops by December 2023, with spikes recorded in the assaults on Avdiivka and Bakhmut. Newsweek quotes the Kremlin-aligned Russian newspaper Izvestia, which claims Russia's training is being adapted to help soldiers survive in difficult situations. Note the use of the term survive rather than win. Russia created a draft document to outline these changes in training, with Plekhanov Russia University Associate Professor Colonel Alexander Perenziev noting that the changes intend to help Russia discover the qualities its troops lack. Physical training is the basis that allows soldiers and officers to effectively carry out their combat missions and survive in difficult situations, claims Perenziev. That approach has led to Russia considering offering pay bonuses of between 15 and 100% of a soldier's salary for any who excel in the physical aspects of their training. These changes suggest that Russia recognizes its training deficiencies, but they may be too little, too late. Worse yet, there's no guarantee that these changes will be widespread enough to encompass every soldier Russia sends into Ukraine. In March 2024, Business Insider reported on a Washington Post article in which Ukrainian soldiers discussed what they saw when fighting in Avdiivka. The soldiers claimed that many of Russia's soldiers were just confused over the roles they were supposed to play, noting that there were massive inconsistencies both in how individual Russian soldiers performed and the equipment they had. There were some with little more than uniforms and basic rifles, while others had more advanced equipment, according to a Ukrainian marksman named Shved. Other soldiers discussed Russia's wave-based approach, claiming that Russia started sending waves of inexperienced, poorly trained, and older soldiers into attacks at least 3 times per day. Again, we come back to Putin's meat grinder approach, in which it seems that the loss of dozens of soldiers to take the life of one Ukrainian appears to be an acceptable strategy. The Institute for the Study of War dug deeper into this wave approach. It says that Russia likes to alternate with its waves. If the first contains inexperienced and poorly trained soldiers, the second will contain veterans who are much more capable. In essence, Putin appears to be using alternative wave attacks to soak up Ukrainian ammunition, followed by the experienced waves coming in to cause more damage in the hope that Ukraine is less capable of fighting back. Not only does this approach mean that Russia stems the bleeding in terms of its rapid losses of elite and more experienced forces, but it also provides a reason for its poor training. The waves being sent in to die don't need much training. They just need to be people who can soak up Ukraine's bullets so that the more experienced soldiers can cause damage. It's a strategy that worked in Avdiivka, albeit with the loss of thousands of soldiers, and it appears to be one that Putin is using to try and take Kharkiv. So we're starting to see a confluence of issues that explain why Russia is losing 1,000 soldiers per day. Those losses are built into its strategy, with the inexperienced and poorly trained being fed into the meat grinder to create room for more experienced operators to do their jobs. That strategy is only viable because Putin cares very little about what happens to his soldiers on the field. As long as they win, it doesn't matter how many Russia loses. The Kremlin's talk of changing its training methods is practically irrelevant in these circumstances. Soldiers will still die by the thousands because of the way they're attacking Ukrainian positions. Which brings us to another reason why Russia is losing 1,000 soldiers per day: low morale. On the surface, poor morale may not seem like it would mean much for the Russian army. It could even be considered a standard feature. Most soldiers don't want to be there and have been conscripted under threat of punishment. However, the morale issue plays into Russia's extensive losses because of the impact it has on Russia's ability to carry out effective operations. That's according to the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, which says that low morale is the foremost weakness across Russia's infantry units. That's a problem because low morale leads to poor unit cohesion and inter-unit cooperation, according to the RUSI. In other words, having poorly trained soldiers who don't want to be on the front lines leads to operations going south because those soldiers don't have their hearts in what they're doing. Compare that to Ukraine soldiers who are fighting tooth and nail for a cause in which they believe, and the suggestion is that many of Russia's soldiers are falling because they don't have enough desire for the fight. That's assuming they fight at all. In April 2024, Ukrainian military intelligence reported that over 18,000 Russian soldiers stationed in the southern military district had deserted their posts. Of that 18,000, 12,000 belonged to the 8th Combined Arms Army, with 10,000 of those being mobilized conscripts. In other words, reservists who have been called up to the Russian army and who clearly don't want to be there. Reporting on the situation, the Kyiv Independent also highlighted that many of the conscripts Russia mobilized in 2022 have been pressured into signing contracts to stay with the army. Again, we see Putin's disregard for his own soldiers. He doesn't care how the soldiers got there or what they actually want. He simply cares about having control over them so he can use them to fight against Ukraine. What's most notable about these desertions is that the 18,000 soldiers face punishment if they're caught. As mentioned earlier, Putin has created a 10-year sentence for deserters, meaning those who are running from the Russian army are so terrified of what's in store for them in Ukraine that they're willing to risk the gulag to get away. Think about how hard a soldier like that is going to fight for Russia. Not very is the likely answer. Now add to this the chaos that losing so many soldiers to desertion has on military operations. A Russian officer or general who's trying to organize an attack must constantly work under the assumption that his soldiers are struggling with morale and may possibly desert. If the latter happens, the attack is weakened, meaning those who remain face a high possibility of being killed. So Russia's heavy losses could be down to many of its attacks being conducted in a weakened form to what was originally intended. Fewer soldiers on the field means less firepower, making the rest easier to pick off for Ukraine. Yet another reason why Russia is losing 1,000 soldiers per day. Finally, we return to strategy and tactics, or more specifically, force design. Russia's military simply isn't built to fight against Ukraine without the loss of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. That was the shared opinion of Rob Lee and Michael Kaufman when they wrote a June 2022 commentary piece for War on the Rocks. They highlighted how Russia's assumption that it would enjoy an easy victory in the early weeks of the war had led it to entering Ukraine with a lack of planning, terrible force employment, and even worse preparation. But far more damaging to Russia, the duo claims, is how it's attempted to adapt when its initial plans failed. Conscious choices and trade-offs lie at the source of many of the most severe problems Russia's military faces, the two claim. The article notes that Russia had a shortage of manpower as far back as June 2022, a shortage it has since attempted to rectify with conscription, contracted soldiers, and the hiring of ex-convicts and mercenary groups to fight on its behalf. Leo and Kaufman claim that Russia failed so spectacularly in the early days of the war due to the military approach it had taken since the fall of the Soviet Union. It abandoned its conscript-heavy army of old, creating a smaller standing force in the process. It also focused on ensuring contracted soldiers made up the majority of its armed forces. The idea was simple: create a smaller, better-equipped army than it had during the Soviet era. The approach was faulty for two reasons. First, it ended up being rolled back, to an extent, in 2013, as many in Russia considered its new standing force to be too small to achieve victory in either a regional or large-scale war. This led to further restructuring, with Lee and Kaufman highlighting the major issue. Assuming a brigade of 3,500 soldiers, it's likely that the brigade would have only 2,500 active duty soldiers during peacetime. Given that a further 30% of the brigade would likely consist of poorly trained conscripts, this means that only 1,700 of the 3,500 would be considered deployable. In other words, Russia's brigades were operating at half capacity at the beginning of the Ukraine war, with everything it's done since essentially trying to play catch-up. Again, it's an example of Russia fighting with weakened units, meaning it experiences more deaths than it should. The second reason is that the idea of having a smaller and well-equipped army only works when you can get the equipment part of that equation right. That's another thing that Russia has failed to do in the Ukraine war. In addition to the earlier mentions of Putin failing to properly equip his soldiers, as seen in Avdiivka, reports abound of Russia relying on Soviet-era equipment to fight against Ukraine. The Jamestown Foundation notes that Russia has been pulling tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery out of storage since the war began. Much of this equipment dates back to the 1940s through to the 1960s, meaning it's been mothballed in poorly maintained warehouses ever since. Not only is this equipment not fit for purpose when faced with modern weapons, such as those Ukraine can access thanks to the military aid it's receiving from other countries, but poor maintenance increases the likelihood of faults. If soldiers can't rely on their equipment to work as it should, they're again more likely to die when assaulting Ukrainian positions. Each of these issues contributes to Russia losing 1,000 soldiers per day. It has a strategy of sending wave after wave of soldiers to take a position. It's a strategy that has worked in Avdiivka and Bakhmut, meaning Putin is confident it'll also work in Kharkiv. The meat grinder has gotten results because Russia has the manpower to make it work, along with a leader who doesn't care how many soldiers Russia loses as long as it gets results. Putin has shown he's willing to use practically anybody in his army, including ex-convicts and inexperienced conscripts, and that Russia's wave-based approach alternates so the less experienced soldiers are used to soak up the bullets during assaults. Add inconsistent training, low morale, old equipment, and the many trade-offs Russia has implemented in its force design in the years prior to the war, and you have a recipe for 1,000 deaths per day. The final question is simple. Can Russia keep fighting, regardless of these high numbers? The simple answer is yes. Given that Putin has already shown how little he cares about ensuring his soldiers are trained and equipped well enough to fight in Ukraine, he can just keep sending more into the meat grinder. The same Business Insider report that highlighted Russia's loss of 1,000 soldiers per day also notes that US officials believe that Russia is replenishing those numbers by recruiting between 25,000 and 30,000 soldiers per month. Add to that the possibility of a second mobilization. In March 2024, Radio Free Europe reported on the opinions of 4 anonymous sources close to the Kremlin, all of whom believe that Russia's president is planning a second wave of mobilization. It's unknown how large this wave will be, though it's possible that it will be as large as that seen in September 2022. That would mean another 300,000 conscripts flooding into Ukraine to get jammed into the meat grinder. Putin's strategy is clear. Unable to compete with Ukraine on the tactical level, in addition to facing a Ukraine that's bolstered by having access to modern Western arms, he aims to win through manpower alone. He leads a country of over 141 million people, 46.4 million of whom are considered fit for service, according to Global Firepower. By contrast, Ukraine's population is just 43.3 million, with 15.4 million being fit for service. Russia has around 3 times the manpower and, as Putin has shown time and time again, it will try to use that manpower to overwhelm Ukrainian positions regardless of the human cost. Will Russia's approach work in the end? Can Russia sustain itself in Ukraine while losing 1,000 soldiers per day? Might Putin start to see his power base erode at home if he continues to show such blatant disregard for the lives of Russia's soldiers? How did Putin's grand vision of a swift, glorious victory turn into a nightmare of staggering losses? Like many dictators before him, Vladimir Putin fell for the idea of a short and glorious war when he decided to invade Ukraine. Much like the German Kaiser Wilhelm II before World War I, he believed his boys would be back home in a few weeks or even days. That didn't happen. It's now 2.5 years later, and Russia has suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, with no end to the conflict in sight. The Russian military is naturally dishonest with its casualty reports, when they come at all, but recent estimates from Western sources like the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense suggest that Russia has suffered over 300,000 total dead or wounded in the war. Mediazona, one of the few independent voices in the country, investigated the register of inheritance cases in Russia in April. Mediazona claimed that these inheritance cases implied about 75,000 dead soldiers in Ukraine over the first 2 years of the war. The number of dead and wounded are accelerating too. Russia has taken the offensive in recent months. Its preferred strategy is to overwhelm defensive Ukrainian positions through mass manpower and firepower, but this is naturally a costly method of waging war. In July, the UK Ministry of Defense estimated that Russia had taken 70,000 casualties just since May, at a pace of around 1,000 per day. This was the highest casualty rate since the invasion began, even more than when Ukraine defeated the Russian forces in Kharkiv and around Kherson in the summer and fall of 22, and composed a tenth of the total Russian casualties to that point. For now, the Russian public has been kept largely in the dark about the true cost of the war in Ukraine, but with these accelerating losses, this ignorance might be starting to fade. He might not need to worry about re-election anymore, but it would be problematic for Putin if the Russian public started to feel like they were suffering too many losses. Yet Putin is in desperate need of more manpower to cover the accelerating casualties. So if you're a dictator, what do? Putin seems to be answering with an approach that many dictators have taken before him since ancient times, relying on foreign mercenaries. How did he get here? Will the new sources of manpower help him to avoid the worst political consequences prolonged warfare could bring his regime? One of the ways that Putin's regime has managed to cover up the worst costs of the war in Ukraine is by concentrating the losses in outlying regions. The April 2024 Mediazona investigation about Russian casualties found that the bulk of them came from the Krasnodar Krai and Bashkortostan areas. It's no coincidence that these two regions account for such a high percentage of the dead and wounded. They are the 3rd and 7th most populated regions in the Russian Federation, respectively. Krasnodar Krai is close to Crimea, which makes it an ideal place from which to transit troops to the front. However, the bigger tell is that Krasnodar Krai and Bashkortostan sit on the edge of Russia's European heartland, where 75% of the country's population is situated. This political geography puts them close enough to the front and with a high enough population to provide a steady supply of soldiers, but far enough from Russia's elite centers of influence in Moscow and St. Petersburg to ensure that their losses won't be noticed too much. Russia has taken this principle and applied it throughout its territory. 80% of Russia's male population between the ages of 18 and 49 are considered eligible for military service, but these men have not been mobilized on an equal basis. Logic would dictate that, all things being equal, most of the available manpower would be from the European heartland, and therefore most of the casualties. But in Putin's Russia, things are far from equal. Russia may be a dictatorship, but even dictators have people they need to answer to. Sending a lot of coffins back to Moscow or St. Petersburg is not something he wants to do. A groundswell of discontent there might be the one source of pressure that he will be forced to take heed of, so he needs to make sure the affluent people there do not suffer too severely. This is why the recruits mobilized for the war effort come heavily from Russia's outlying areas. They are poorer than the national average and disproportionately composed of ethnic or religious minorities. In the autumn of 2022, as Putin began his first wave of partial mobilization in response to Ukraine's battlefield successes, The Economist did an analysis of available data on the Russian forces in Ukraine. The publication found that the regions outside the European heartland provided a disproportionate share of the troops. For example, Krasnoyarsk Krai in Siberia saw about 5.5% of its eligible manpower conscripted in 2022. In contrast, less than 1% of the eligible manpower in Moscow was conscripted in the same time span. The Economist also found that 23 of the 26 regions which supplied most of the Russian manpower in Ukraine were below the national income average. Other sources back the assertion that the war's heaviest costs are being imposed on Russia's poor, minority, and outlying populations. The BBC conducted an investigation in September 2022 on 6,000 confirmed Russian deaths. Of these, troops from the Krasnodar Krai, Dagestan in the southern Caucasus, and Buryatia in the Russian Far East suffered the largest share. The 2021 Russian census revealed that Ukrainians made up the smallest ethnic group in Krasnodar Krai, with 2.54% of the population. 5.87% were Armenians, and 83.03% were ethnic Russians. The same census revealed that only 12.5% of Dagestan's population was ethnically Russian. The other portion came from various minority groups. The majority of Buryatia's population, at 52.7%, is composed of ethnic Russians. However, 43.8% are minority Buryats, a Mongolic ethnic group. Each of these regions recorded at least 200 deaths of the 6,000 confirmed. In contrast, only 15 people from the Moscow area, which composes around 10% of Russia's total population, were among the dead. The mobilized troops from the far-flung regions proved vital in stabilizing the Russian forces while they were in retreat and rapidly losing territory. However, they were often improperly trained and prepared for the hardships to come. They lacked body armor. Some reports even suggested they lacked rifles. Worse, many of the regular Russian troops forced them to fight in the front ranks, so they would become casualties instead of the veterans. Vasily Matanov, the founder of the group Asians of Russia, best summed up the situation. These people are less defended. If they were to start rounding up Muscovites, then everyone would hear about it. Foreign leaders even got in on the act, with former president of Mongolia accusing the Kremlin of using its ethnic Mongol population as cannon fodder. So far, Putin has ignored this reality because he can. However, the population in a lot of these areas is low. Not many people live in Siberia. Therefore, there are only so many eligible men to be called to the colors from Russia's outlying regions. With the rate they are becoming casualties in Ukraine, Moscow's ability to continue dumping the costs of the war on its poorest and least well-connected people is in doubt, and shortages of available replacements have already been reported by European sources. The Kremlin also does not want to resume recruitment of prisoners, whose ranks have already been thinned. This gives us a preview about the next phase of the war. Conscription was not the only reason why so many of these vulnerable men joined the Russian military. For the troops from impoverished regions where opportunities are few, military service is the only realistic way to make money. Russia now seems to be keen to export this model abroad, literally. Rather than conscript people from Moscow and St. Petersburg and create political problems, the Kremlin is looking to foreign countries to find new sources of manpower. Russia's authoritarian form of government allows it to come up with creative ways of finding manpower without resorting to a full mobilization. In response to the new casualties in Ukraine, it's taken to targeting foreign students. African nationals in Russia on work visas have also been targeted. The Kremlin has given both of these groups a new choice. They can sign contracts with Russia's Ministry of Defense and become soldiers, or be deported to their countries of origin. The UK Ministry of Defense reports that Central Asian migrants have also been targeted. There are many of these in the country, and their governments tend to be friendly to Russia due to prior Soviet ties. The British report that Russian law enforcement has concentrated on Central Asian migrants with coercive methods, inventing criminal charges, and then declaring that they must sign military contracts to avoid arrest. But it's not just people working in Russia. Africans in Africa have also been a keen source of interest for Russian recruiters. As early as the spring of 2023, reports of African troops fighting for Russia in Ukraine began to circulate. At first, these troops were reported within the Wagner Group's ranks during the Battle of Bakhmut, where the unit suffered severe losses. Given Wagner's long presence on the African continent, this might not be surprising, but Russia's ties with Africa go back to the Cold War. In that era, the Soviet Union invited African students to study within its borders as a way of increasing its influence in countries that only had recently achieved independence from European empires. The tradition continued after the Soviet Union collapsed, and roughly 35,000 African students are studying in Russia today. Many Africans have favorable opinions about Russia even now, remembering that the Soviet Union supported their efforts in freeing themselves from European colonial rule and Moscow's dogged opposition to the apartheid regime in South Africa. In a March 2022 vote of the United Nations General Assembly, 17 African countries, including South Africa, refused to condemn Russia for its invasion, instead choosing to not participate in the resolution. The use of African troops expanded in 2023. As the year went on, intelligence sources reported on the existence of a so-called Africa Corps in the Russian army, which had a roster of about 5,000 men. Many of these troops had already served in the Wagner Group and were experienced fighters, veterans of the Syrian civil war and conflicts in Libya, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Russia has also simply taken to recruiting mercenaries from abroad directly, again preferring Africa. Not coincidentally, as Russian casualties were accelerating in the spring of 2024, reports began to circulate that the Kremlin was redoubling its efforts to bring these foreign fighters in. Ukrainian intelligence sources report that Russian recruitment drives have ramped up in sub-Saharan Africa. The bulk of the effort seems to be concentrated in 4 countries: Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, and Uganda. Somalia may also be a target. With its long civil war, it has experienced fighters, and Somalis have been a known presence in Russia's already existing Africa Corps. Russian military recruiters are reportedly offering troops from these and other African countries a $2,200 monthly salary, a $2,000 bonus for signing up, health insurance, and Russian passports for themselves and their families. As generally the average annual incomes in these nations is $2,290 in Congo, $930 in Uganda and Rwanda, $600 in Somalia, and $200 in Burundi. This offer is obviously an attractive one. One Nigerian soldier fighting for Ukraine in 2022 grimly reported that life there, even in a war zone, was more desirable than his impoverished homeland, where the annual income is $2,160. Many African mercenaries fighting on the opposite side of the war probably think the same. The population in sub-Saharan Africa is also growing faster than any other portion of the world. It's a young source of manpower, which is notable considering that the average age of the soldiers on both sides of the war in Ukraine is in the 30s and 40s, far older than wars in the past. This is because Russia and Ukraine's populations are aging rapidly. In Africa, Putin has a source of manpower he may be hoping to call upon in the long term. It's not known how many Africans have taken up the Russian offer, but their presence is growing in Ukraine. Russia does not seem to be limiting its recruitment efforts to Africans or Central Asians. It's reportedly tried to bring in troops from as far afield as Nepal, India, and Cuba. Russia has had long ties to the Cuban regime stretching back to the Cold War. Meanwhile, although India has steadily come closer to the United States thanks to ongoing tensions with China, it maintains a tradition of security ties to Russia. It buys Russian military equipment like the T-90 tank and the S-400 air defense system, even risking American sanctions to do so. New Delhi has also abstained from condemning Russia for the invasion in the UN General Assembly. Its increased purchases of Russian energy have been vital in stabilizing Moscow's financial coffers since the invasion began. Despite this, Indian students have reportedly been targeted by Russia's military recruiters using the same coercive methods. According to India's embassy in Russia, there are about 14,000 Indian nationals in Russia, with roughly 4,500 students enrolled in Russian higher educational institutions. This would not be a significant source of manpower for long, so Putin's regime seems to be getting even more creative in how it's luring additional Indians to fight in its ranks. At least 100 Indian soldiers have been documented fighting in the Russian army in Ukraine, but Putin's regime seems to want to increase this number, no matter how underhanded the methods. In early 2024, Indian authorities uncovered what they called a Russian human trafficking ring. The operation began with Russian recruiters offering young Indian men positions as helpers in the military establishment of Russia. If the Indian men accepted the offer, they would require training. Unfortunately for them, this training was the hardest form of training possible, being sent to the front. The Russian agents reportedly offered these men a monthly salary of around $1,800. Considering the average annual income in India is $2,390, this was an attractive idea. But there was a catch. The Indian men needed to pay the Russian agents about $3,600 to get started. Since this is a sum most Indians cannot afford, the men needed to get the money through a loan. Conveniently, they were then on the hook. Such tactics are common in human trafficking networks. Russian recruiters are reportedly using similar tactics in Nepal, the United Arab Emirates, and Sri Lanka. As of December 2023, at least 100 Nepali men were missing or injured in Russia, with 10 deaths confirmed and 4 confirmed prisoners. The Nepali authorities suspect that there were a lot more. It reached the point that the Nepali government had no choice but to deny permits to any of its citizens who wanted to pursue work in Ukraine or Russia. Why would the Kremlin go to such lengths to avoid mobilizing people from the main European heartland, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg, to the point that it would even risk deteriorating the relationship with India, one of its most important post-invasion economic partners? Because all wars are political. Russia has a history of fighting costly wars. In World War I, the cost became so great that the country saw not one but 2 revolutions in a single year, which toppled 2 successive regimes. Putin is aware of this history. Putting more of the burden on the major Russian population centers risks him losing power. Ukrainian sources report that the Russian public is becoming increasingly frustrated about pro-war propaganda, particularly among families of wounded soldiers who see their loved ones being sent back to the front. According to some relatives of these troops, they are returned to the battlefield even when they are sick, have mental fatigue, or have suffered injuries that only recently healed. One mother of a mobilized soldier asked on Russian social media, what kind of stormtroopers would they be if they can't even carry a gun? These people are more likely to be informed of the real situation. Even allowing for some embellishment since the source was from Ukraine, it's easy to see why Putin cannot allow more influential people to see past his propaganda. It's fine for him if families from Siberia or the Caucasus say this. It isn't fine if these people are from Russia's major metropolitan areas. The propaganda also isn't fooling some other people. Russia's military bloggers have repeatedly expressed frustration that despite recent efforts, the size of the invasion force is not enough to conduct the level of offensive operations needed to secure a decisive victory in Ukraine. There are not enough people being mobilized or joining the ranks, despite increases in payments for those who sign military contracts within Russia and the efforts to get people to sign up from abroad. Russia is also losing men too quickly for the force to stabilize. President Zelensky said in a June interview that the Russians were suffering 6 casualties for every dead or wounded Ukrainian. These words should be taken with a grain of salt, since both sides have overestimated the casualties the other has taken in the war. Still, Russia has undoubtedly suffered disproportionately thanks to its poor handling of its military, and this poor handling is becoming increasingly difficult for Putin's regime to cover up, thanks to the depletion of available men from Siberia and the other poorer regions in the country. Perhaps the recent Russian drives are more a sign of desperation than anything else, with Putin trying to secure as much land and bargaining power as possible before the wheels come off the Russian war machine. In late 2023, the Estonian Ministry of Defense laid out a clear objective for the Ukrainians: kill or maim 100,000 Russians in 2024. Doing so, the Estonians said, would ensure a Russian defeat in 2025. Their math was based on Russia's ability to train about 260,000 troops every year. Losing so many men would force Russia to send units to the front with less training. These troops would, in turn, die faster, increasing the demand on the Russian system until it becomes overwhelmed. There is a political side to these calculations that the Estonians might not have emphasized as much as they should. By overwhelming Russia's preferred sources of manpower, Putin will then need to choose between getting the troops he needs to sustain his operations or potentially risk upsetting the people in Russia's elite cities by calling upon their as yet largely untapped reserve of manpower. This is why Putin is willing to go to such lengths to secure alternative sources of soldiers, and indeed, the recruitment of foreign troops puts a new item in this equation. By bringing foreign fighters into the war by inducement or coercion, Putin is hoping he can afford to suffer more losses in Ukraine while avoiding rocking the boat in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But what do you think? Will Russia's increasing use of foreign fighters throw a monkey wrench into the Estonians' calculations and prolong Putin's ability to continue the war while avoiding the backlash that would come with a full mobilization of the Russian population? Or do you think this too will fail, and Putin will eventually have no choice but to mobilize more people from Moscow and St. Petersburg in a desperate, high-risk gamble to win the war? For months, a large-scale Russian summer offensive was all anyone was talking about. Ever since the reputable US think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW for short, warned about the Kremlin's plans, the media has been in a frenzy, labeling the ensuing period as key in the Russo-Ukrainian war and saying that it could even end the war in Ukraine. Western analysts speculated, the Ukrainian government prepared, and the world held its breath. The anticipation was palpable, the tension unbearable, and then nothing. Sure, the much-anticipated summer offensive did come, with a combined force of 40,000 Russian troops launching an assault across Ukraine's northern border on May 9th, Russia's Victory Day, symbolizing the country's triumph over Nazi Germany in World War II. Of course, the date was chosen deliberately to evoke a sense of historical destiny and inevitable success over the neo-Nazi regime, which is what Russian President Vladimir Putin claimed Ukraine has become. Yet despite the dramatic timing and intense build-up, the offensive spluttered and evoked the name of William Shakespeare's famous comedy, Much Ado About Nothing. Even NATO's top officials like Christopher Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, weren't sure whether the offensive had actually begun or not, which speaks volumes about its underwhelming execution and lack of impact. Though Russia did make some advances and continues to do so, this summer offensive can, for the most part, be labeled as a colossal failure. Why? And how is it possible for the offensive previously hailed as the war-ending blow to come to a halt after barely a few miles in? That's precisely what you'll find out in this video. You'll also learn how and why the offensive started in the first place, what it aimed to achieve, and what's in store for the future of this conflict. Let's begin. The number one question that probably comes to mind when hearing about a Russian summer offensive is, How was Russia even able to launch it? After all, the Russian armed forces had faced significant setbacks in the preceding months and, let's face it, the entire invasion of Ukraine. According to a May 8th report by the General Staff of Ukraine's armed forces, by the invasion date, Russia had lost as many as 477,430 troops in Ukraine. Similar losses in equipment were reported as well, with Russia bidding farewell to 7,418 tanks, 14,246 armored fighting vehicles, 16,549 vehicles and fuel tanks, 12,317 artillery systems, 1,057 multiple launch rocket systems, 792 air defense systems, 349 aircraft, 325 helicopters, 9,728 drones, 26 ships and boats, and 1 submarine. So how was Russia able to pull off an offensive in the summer of 2024? The answer is simple. Russia did what Russia does best: exploit vulnerabilities. You see, Russia has suffered immense losses since February 24, 2022, when the invasion first started. But so did Ukraine. The defending force was grappling with a shortage of men and ammunition, allowing Russia to capitalize on these weaknesses. However, there was one thing that primarily gave Russia the initiative to launch its summer offensive: the delay in Western aid. The US, Ukraine's largest donor with over $43 billion in military aid provided in just 2 years, faced a challenging period starting in the fall of 2023 when new aid packages were held up. This delay was primarily due to the intense debates in Congress, where some members questioned the continuation of military support in the face of competing domestic priorities. During these discussions, concerns over immigration and border security took center stage, leading to a temporary pause in aid decisions. Unfortunately, while these debates were ongoing, the Ukrainian battlefield faced significant challenges. The delay in military supplies allowed Russia to capitalize on its temporary advantage in firepower, escalating attacks along the 600-mile front. These operations started in October 2023 and had a single goal: to demoralize Ukraine in the West. As months passed and no aid arrived, the Russian armed forces became wrongly convinced that their plan was working. That's where the idea for the summer offensive was likely conceived. Thanks to making some tactical gains in midwinter, the Kremlin seemingly became convinced that it could eventually collapse the Ukrainian defense line, as an ISW report puts it, and so the preparations began. Obviously, the ultimate goal was to cause a general collapse of the Ukrainian front line and achieve a grand Russian breakthrough after months of suffering humiliating losses. But what were the specific military objectives of the summer offensive? The truth is, no one outside the Kremlin knows. The summer offensive has been executed so poorly that all we're left with is guesswork and speculation about its true military objectives. According to Michael Kaufman, a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Russia's goal was only to stretch out Ukraine's forces and deal a decisive blow to its combat strength. Others saw the summer offensive as a blitzkrieg attempt whose ultimate goal was Kyiv, the city that Putin has long coveted as the ultimate prize. He holds an almost mystical reverence for Kyiv, considering it the very heart of Russian civilization. However, the prevailing view is that the Russian summer offensive is nothing but a ruse. You see, the offensive was launched in the Kharkiv Oblast, opening a new northern front in Ukraine. However, many analysts believe that seizing Kharkiv isn't the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is for the Ukrainian troops to believe Russia is after Kharkiv, compelling them to redeploy their eastern forces to the north. With Ukraine's position in the east weakened, Russia would be able to achieve its true goal, capturing, or as the Kremlin puts it, liberating the entire Donetsk Oblast. Seizing Donetsk has long been one of Putin's main goals, as it would solidify Russia's control over a crucial part of eastern Ukraine and bolster the Kremlin's strategic position in the region. After Donetsk, there's Luhansk, and before you know it, the Kremlin could potentially establish a contiguous corridor of control through the Donbas region. Of course, there are also those who believe that the Russian commanders purposefully made the goals of the summer offensive unclear, allowing them to change them depending on the Ukrainian response. While this approach can be viewed as flexible, it likely reflects a lack of clear strategy and tendency toward opportunistic, reactive planning rather than decisive, well-thought-out objectives, aka the Russian special. But to be honest, by now, it doesn't even matter what the initial goals were or whether they even existed. All that matters is that Russia failed to achieve them. Before discussing why, let's do a brief overview of the course of the summer offensive and the tactics used to understand how the situation unfolded and went wrong. As mentioned, the offensive officially started on May 9th. However, May 10th was when the Russian forces started shelling positions in the direction of the city of Vovchansk in the Kharkiv Oblast using guided bombs. The very same day, the Russian troops attempted to break through the front line, with about 5 Russian infantry battalions crossing the state border and capturing the villages of Borisivka, Krasna, Pilna, and Strilecha. From there, Russia made some of its biggest territorial gains in 18 months. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Russian forces seized control of roughly 10 villages by May 17th, advancing some 6 miles into the Kharkiv Oblast. However, it's important to note that these villages were mostly lightly defended small settlements. The offensive operations continued every day throughout May, but no changes to the front lines were recorded. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that Russia's much-anticipated summer offensive stalled by early June, before the summer even officially began. By June 6th, the Russian forces ceased their offensive towards Lipsy, a village in Kharkiv Oblast the Russians were previously heavily pursuing. This probably had to do with the stiff Ukrainian defenses waiting for them in the area, reinforced by a few mechanized brigades, each about 2,000 strong, that arrived from the south. The Ukrainian forces also intensified counterattacks, managing to push their Russian counterparts back from several areas. By the end of June, there were no changes to the front line, and Ukraine managed to recapture many of the positions the Russian troops claimed in the initial push. July started just as forcefully, with the 3rd Assault Brigade claiming that it eliminated an entire battalion of Russian soldiers, killing 154 and wounding 301. The brigade also took credit for the destruction of a D-20 howitzer, 3 Russian-made Zala drones, and a tank. The fighting continued throughout July, and yet there were no recorded changes to the front line. On July 14th, the ISW reported a claim that the Russian Northern Grouping of Forces, the unit responsible for the summer offensive, didn't have enough troops for a fully fledged penetration of Ukrainian defenses to a depth of 25 miles. As you can see, the Russian tactic of pursuing multiple efforts simultaneously up and down the front didn't exactly pan out. Of course, Putin framed the embarrassing performance of his troops in Kharkiv Oblast as intentional, saying that Moscow isn't seeking any quick gains and that slow advances are all part of their strategy. As for the specific tactics used on the battlefield, they can best be described in one word: bizarre. Based on the accounts of the Ukrainian soldiers, the Russian troops would put soldiers on motorcycles and send them off toward the front line. The goal was to ride as fast as possible and avoid being hit. The ones who survived this suicide mission would ditch the bikes and move into trenches, fighting as infantry. This insane tactic had to be deployed for one reason: Russia has had issues with the lack of armor for its ground forces. Another solution for this issue came in the form of the so-called turtle tanks. Turtle tanks are makeshift armored vehicles, often cobbled together from available resources to compensate for the shortage of the more advanced and heavily protected tanks. These vehicles resemble a moving barn, and their goal is to absorb fire in an effort to clear a path for other units. With these risky tactics in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that Russia lost quite a few military personnel and much equipment in this summer offensive. But before discussing the reasons why this offensive failed so spectacularly and resulted in excessive loss of people and weapons, let's focus on the one that set the stage for the failure in Kharkiv Oblast: poor preparation. As mentioned, the idea for the Russian summer offensive was born out of the opportunity to exploit the destabilization of the Ukrainian forces due to a lack of military aid. As months dragged on, only 2 scenarios emerged for Ukraine. One, it would not be receiving US military aid again, as the political climate shifted and the support for Ukraine within the country waned. Or 2, the delivery of aid would eventually resume, but it would take some time before the first weapons arrived in Ukraine. Although the Kremlin was convinced that scenario number 1 was far more likely, the Russians still didn't want to take any chances. This meant that they only had a limited window of opportunity to strike before the arrival of resumed US security assistance. So the Russian armed forces rushed to carry out their theater-wide offensive. However, in doing so, they seemingly forgot a crucial aspect of military strategy: thorough preparation. Benjamin Franklin once said, "If you fail to plan, you're planning to fail." And that's precisely what Russia did. The hasty approach led to poorly coordinated efforts, a lack of clear objectives, and a failure to truly capitalize on the initial advantage they sought to exploit. According to Kaufman, the offensive was launched way too early. His exact words were, "It's now clear that the Russians launched the Kharkiv offensive about a month before it was planned." The idea was to take the Ukrainian forces by surprise, which was somewhat accomplished based on the initial Russian success. However, the offensive seemingly took the Russians by surprise too, as some of the units assigned to the operation, such as the 4th Army Corps, hadn't even finished training. So instead of Ukrainians peeling troops out of the Donbass to send them up north, which was one of the goals of the offensive, the Russians ended up reassigning troops from the east. The lack of proper preparation can also be seen in the fact that the summer offensive was supposed to be carried out with 100,000 soldiers. However, even well past the start of the offensive, the ISW estimated there were 70,000 soldiers at most, even placing the lower end of the estimate at 30,000. It's clear that the Kremlin didn't allow sufficient time to mobilize, train, and deploy the necessary forces, further exacerbating the Russian operational deficiencies. So instead of taking Kharkiv Oblast by storm, all that Putin's poorly prepared offensive managed to achieve was to produce catastrophically high casualty rates. How high are we talking? the highest in the entire conflict. According to the British Ministry of Defense, Russia was losing as many as 1,262 soldiers per day in May and 1,162 in June. Similar figures were seen in July and August, with Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi explaining that the Russians were willing to suffer heavy losses for minor gains. But if we're being honest, this is nothing new in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Even if the summer offensive was carefully planned and executed, chances are there would still be high casualty rates due to Putin's fondness for the so-called meat grinder military tactic. This tactic essentially involves overwhelming the enemy with sheer numbers, sending wave after wave of troops into battle regardless of the heavy losses. In Kharkiv, Putin showed that even a lack of substantial troop numbers didn't prevent him from sacrificing Russian lives with similar tactics. The motorcycle riders we discussed earlier are a prime example of this brutal strategy, which highlights the costly nature of Russia's approach to warfare. As operator Starsky, a Ukrainian veteran and blogger, puts it, Russians use their soldiers as cannon fodder. This is further proven by sending soldiers to battle in embarrassingly small units once the meat grinder runs out of large quantities of meat. According to numerous Western analysts, that's precisely what prevented Russia from making any substantial gains, let alone a breakthrough in Ukraine's defensive lines in Kharkiv. Approximately 10 to 15 unmounted infantry troops would make probing attacks to test defenses. In worst-case scenarios, as few as 6 men would try to sneak across no man's land to gain a trench foothold. But regardless of the exact approach the Russian forces take, the result remains the same: a substantial loss of life. From there, their general approach is just to mobilize more troops once the initial waves have been depleted. That's why Russia has been mobilizing about 30,000 people per month since 2024 began. As a result of this horrifying approach, Russia lost over 70,000 troops in only 2 months, with the Kharkiv offensive significantly contributing to these figures. This astronomical figure, provided by British intelligence, includes both wounded and killed soldiers. With it, the total number of Russian troop losses in Ukraine from February 24, 2022 to July 31, 2024 amounts to an astronomical 578,120. Worst of all, as long as the summer offensive continues, Russia's casualty rates are likely to average above 1,000 per day. Now, there's a reason why the numbers of killed and injured soldiers are reported together. In general, the soldiers who have been gravely injured on the battlefield don't return to the fight, meaning they contribute to the general loss of combat effectiveness. However, when it comes to Russia, any rules of military engagement fly straight out of the window, not unlike many of Putin's adversaries. You see, the members of the Ukrainian army have reported numerous cases of injured Russian soldiers being sent back to the front lines despite suffering debilitating injuries. Of course, by going back, they've all but signed their death warrant, raising the number of Russian fatalities and further weakening their offensive. Unfortunately, these cases aren't even the most horrific stories coming from the Russian ranks. According to operator Starsky, there are many reported cases, and even more disturbingly, videos, of Russian forces committing suicide because they're left stranded by their own, abandoned in dire conditions with no medical support or hope of rescue. With how little the Kremlin cares about its soldiers, can anyone truly blame them for the lack of morale and dedication needed to pull off something as ambitious as the summer offensive? What further complicates their situation is the heavy equipment losses in Kharkiv. After all, a soldier without proper gear is a sitting duck doomed to face slaughter. For Russia, the trouble lies in the fact that it can't replace the destroyed equipment. Even though Putin has ramped up military production to unprecedented levels, the constraints on the Russian defense industrial base are more than evident. For now, Ukrainian forces seem to be most proud of destroying Russian tanks, which forces the country's troops to resort to their ridiculous turtle tanks and fighter jets like the Sukhoi Su-25, which have been launching the devastating guided aerial bombs used in the region. When it comes to destroying Russian equipment in the border areas, the Ukrainian forces have seemed to heavily focus on the country's air defense systems. While these actions have contributed to significant Russian losses during the offensive, they primarily reflect a strategic focus on crippling key components of Russia's military capability before a crucial event: the arrival of the F-16 Fighting Falcon fighter jets. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been pleading for these jets practically since the invasion started. Even after Western allies finally pledged a number of the F-16s to Ukraine, the delivery has been plagued by numerous delays, leaving the Ukrainian forces waiting and hoping for a decisive boost to their air capabilities. Even so, they work on creating the right conditions for when these aircraft finally came. And good news for Ukraine, on July 31st, the first batch officially arrived. For now, we don't know how many jets Ukraine received and where they all came from. All we know is that they are part of at least 79 units pledged by the Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium and Norway, and that they have the potential to completely crush the Russian offensive. The same goes for the rest of the Western-supplied military aid. Following the 6-month-long legislative blockade of the $61 billion military aid package for Ukraine, the US rushed to deliver help to the country as soon as the package was approved in late April. Of course, such a huge amount of aid has to be transferred in stages, but the first installment already made all the difference in the Kharkiv Oblast. Thanks to the ammunition and armored vehicles received from the US, the Ukrainian forces were able to fight back more and more as the offensive progressed. So while aiming to take advantage of the lack of aid, the Kremlin only managed to get the military aid package passed and delivered sooner. However, this isn't even the most consequential outcome of Russia's summer offensive. Thanks to this offensive, Ukraine's Western allies finally allowed the country to do something it had pleaded for since the invasion started: strike targets on Russian soil. You see, prior to June 2024, the Ukrainian forces were only allowed to use Western-supplied weapons to defend their territories, including the occupied areas. This significantly limited their operational scope and the potential to disrupt the Russian war machine. Seeing all the initial chaos caused by the summer offensive, the US finally lifted the ban, with other major European allies like the UK and Germany following suit. However, it's important to note that the ban was only lifted partially. What does this mean? It means that Ukraine still can't use Western-supplied weapons to indiscriminately target Russia. It can only use these weapons to target border areas used to launch attacks on Ukraine during the Kharkiv offensive. Though not an ideal scenario, this permission has been sufficient to apply pressure to Russian supply lines and command posts, halting the summer offensive. Generally speaking, Ukraine starting to fight back has been one of the major reasons Russia's summer offensive failed. When the offensive was first announced, most military experts were rather pessimistic about Ukraine's fate due to the country's severe shortage of troops, shells, and pre-established defensive positions. But then Ukraine managed to adapt and overcome, as it always does. Each of these problems was gradually being addressed. The lack of shells was covered by the incoming Western aid. To address the lack of soldiers, Zelensky signed a bill lowering the mobilization age for combat duty from 27 to 25. Though the numbers of subsequently drafted soldiers are kept a secret, it's clear that the bill helped Ukraine generate more fighting power in Kharkiv and beyond almost instantly. Unsurprisingly, the Kremlin didn't account for this when preparing the summer offensive, just as it didn't account for the arrival of the aid or stiff Ukrainian resistance. Echoing the sentiment of the entire invasion, Russia's miscalculations cost the country any potential victory in Kharkiv and beyond. All things considered, it becomes obvious why the Kharkiv offensive has been a huge failure. Not only did the offensive fail to accomplish any of the supposed goals, but it also actually weakened Russia's position in Ukraine. The Russian forces practically squandered firepower, which might have made a difference in another portion of the 600-mile front line. That's not to mention that the offensive cost thousands of soldiers' lives after being forced to attack on foot while unprotected. But take heart. Despite the challenges, Ukraine has shown remarkable strength and determination in the face of Russia's aggression. While there have been signs of continued Russian activity in Kharkiv as of August 1st, these are more of a reflection of Russia's desperation than its strength. Ukraine has successfully averted the worst-case scenario, and this is no small feat. With each passing day, Ukraine's forces grow stronger and more unified, ready to face whatever comes next. The journey is far from over, but Ukraine is more than capable of turning these ongoing challenges into future victories. So what do you think? Which will be next? Will it happen in Kharkiv or another part of the front line? If you're going with Kharkiv, do you think Russia has any chance to recover in this region, or is the summer offensive officially a lost cause?